You've been lied to about giving. They told you that the more you sacrifice, the more love you will receive, that being there for everyone makes you noble, strong, and worthy. But if that were true, why do so many kind people feel exhausted? Why do you feel heavy even after doing so much for others? Why does your heart feel tired, your mind feel crowded, and your spirit feel like it has nothing left to give? The truth is, giving without wisdom can slowly empty you. Love was never meant to cost you your peace, and Buddhist wisdom reveals why. For centuries, great teachers have understood that suffering begins when compassion loses balance, when helping turns into self-abandonment, and when the need to be needed becomes stronger than the need to be whole. Tonight, as you listen to these lessons, something will begin to shift. Your breathing will soften, the pressure inside you will start to loosen, and you will feel a quiet clarity rising where guilt and exhaustion used to live. When you wake up tomorrow, you may begin to see your kindness differently, not as something that must destroy you, but as something that can flow with peace. This is not just another audio to fall asleep to. This is a return to yourself waiting to happen. Are you ready? Let's begin. Something inside you already knows this feeling. That quiet tiredness that no amount of sleep seems to fix. That strange heaviness that follows you even on days when nothing bad has happened. It lingers in the background like a low noise you cannot turn off. And the more you try to ignore it, the louder it becomes. Because what you are feeling is not just physical exhaustion, it is something deeper. Something built slowly over time, layer by layer, choice by choice, until it became your normal. And it begins in a place that looks harmless. It begins with always being there. There is a version of you that people admire. The one who replies quickly, who listens patiently, who shows up even when it is inconvenient. The one who carries conversations, who smooths tension, who senses when something is wrong before anyone says a word. That version of you feels like your strength. It feels like your identity. It feels like the reason people stay. But beneath that version, something else has been quietly growing. A constant state of readiness, a silent alertness that never switches off. Your mind is always slightly open, slightly waiting, slightly leaning outward toward the needs of others. Even in moments that should belong to you, a part of your attention is elsewhere. You are half resting, half anticipating, half present, half preparing. And over time, that state becomes your baseline. You wake up, and before you fully arrive in your own body, your mind is already scanning. Who might need you today? What messages might be waiting? What emotional weight might land on you next? Even silence begins to feel temporary, like a pause before the next demand. This is where the hidden violence begins. Not loud, not dramatic, but constant. It is the quiet act of abandoning your own inner space so others can occupy it without resistance. It is the habit of making room for everyone else without ever asking if there is still room left for you. And the most dangerous part is that it feels like kindness. Because no one teaches you that there is a difference between being open and being unguarded, between being present and being permanently available, between caring and dissolving. So you keep going. You answer when you are tired. You listen when you are overwhelmed. You show up even when something inside you is asking for distance. And each time you ignore that inner voice, you move a little further away from yourself. At first, the cost is small, a little less energy, a little less patience, a little less joy. But over time, the cost grows, because your mind was never designed to live in constant readiness. In Buddhist understanding, the mind needs stillness the same way the body needs rest. Not just physical stillness, but emotional quiet. Space where nothing is expected, nothing is required, nothing is being monitored or managed. Without that space, the mind becomes crowded. And when the mind is crowded, even small interactions begin to feel heavy. That is why simple conversations can start to feel draining, not because the people are difficult, but because your inner space is already full. There is no room left to receive without effort, but instead of stepping back, most people push forward. They try to be more patient, more understanding, more available, not realizing that the problem is not a lack of effort, it is the absence of boundaries. There is a deep misunderstanding that boundaries are something cold, something distant, something that creates separation. But in reality, boundaries are what protect connection. Without them, giving stops being a choice. It becomes a reflex. And when giving is no longer a choice, it slowly loses its meaning. Buddhist wisdom speaks about awareness as the beginning of all change, seeing clearly what is happening inside, without judgment, without resistance. So pause for a moment and notice something. Notice how often your attention moves outward, even when nothing is happening. Notice how quickly your mind shifts from your own experience to the possibility of someone else's need. Notice how being off feels unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. That discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that you are not used to being with yourself without distraction. Because constant availability has trained your mind to believe that its purpose is to respond. But your mind was not created only to respond. It was created to experience, to feel, to observe, to rest. And when those parts are ignored for too long, exhaustion becomes inevitable. There is also a subtle fear hidden beneath this pattern. A fear that if you are not available, something will be lost. Connection, approval, belonging. So you stay open, even when you are tired. You stay responsive, even when you need silence. You stay present for others, even when you are absent from yourself. And this is where the deepest form of self-abandonment happens, not in one big moment, but in small, repeated choices. Choosing others over your own limits. Choosing responsiveness over rest. Choosing to be needed over being whole. But here is what Buddhist understanding gently reveals. You are not responsible for holding the emotional weight of the world. You are not required to be accessible at all times to be worthy of love. You are not here to live in permanent readiness for others. True compassion does not demand that you disappear. It asks that you remain aware, aware of your limits, aware of your energy, aware of the moment when giving begins to take more than it offers. Because that moment is not failure, it is information. It is your mind telling you that balance has been lost. And instead of listening, most people override it. They tell themselves to push through, to be stronger, to not disappoint. But strength is not the ability to keep giving endlessly. Strength is the ability to stop when stopping is needed. There is a quiet power in stepping back before you break, in choosing silence before resentment builds, in allowing yourself to exist without being available. At first, it may feel unfamiliar. You may notice a sense of guilt, like you are doing something wrong, but that guilt is not truth. It is conditioning. It is the echo of a belief that your value comes from how much you give. And the moment you begin to question that belief, something starts to change. You begin to reclaim small pieces of your energy, small moments where your mind is not reaching outward but resting inward. And in those moments, something unexpected happens. You start to feel yourself again. Not the version of you that is always needed, but the version of you that simply exists, calm, present, unburdened. This is where healing begins, not by doing more, but by allowing less. Less noise, less obligation, less constant readiness. And as you continue, you will start to see something clearly. That your exhaustion was never a sign that you are too weak to give. It was a sign that you were never meant to give like this. You were never meant to live with your inner door always open. You were meant to choose when to open it and when to close it, not out of rejection, but out of respect for your own space. Because the mind that knows how to rest is the same mind that can truly give. without losing itself. Something begins to shift the moment you realize that your exhaustion is not coming from caring, but from how you have been caring. That quiet awareness opens a door, and behind it, there is a deeper truth waiting to be seen. Because even after you start protecting your space, even after you begin stepping back from constant availability, there is still a question that lingers beneath everything. Why does something that feels so pure, so human, so right, end up hurting you? Why does kindness, over time, begin to feel heavy? There is a subtle line that most people never learn to see, a line between compassion that nourishes and compassion that slowly drains. And crossing that line does not happen all at once. It happens gently, almost invisibly. At first, giving feels natural. You offer your time, your attention, your understanding. You feel connected. You feel useful. You feel like your presence matters in someone's life. There is warmth in that. There is meaning in that. But something begins to change. When giving stops being guided by awareness and starts being driven by habit, you begin to say yes before you even check how you feel. You begin to offer support before you understand what it will cost you. You begin to step into people's emotional worlds without asking whether you have the strength to hold what you are about to carry. And slowly, compassion starts to lose its balance. In Buddhist understanding, compassion is never meant to stand alone. It is always paired with wisdom. Without wisdom, compassion can become something else entirely. It can become attachment. It can become obligation. It can become a quiet form of self-neglect. True compassion is not just about feeling for others. It is about seeing clearly. Seeing where help is needed, but also seeing where limits are necessary. Without that clarity, kindness begins to stretch beyond what the heart can sustain, and when the heart stretches too far, it begins to ache. This is where suffering enters, not because you care too much, but because your caring has no direction. It flows outward endlessly without returning inward. It gives and gives and gives without ever pausing to restore. And eventually, even the smallest act of kindness starts to feel like effort. You begin to notice something uncomfortable. You still want to care, but you no longer have the energy. You still want to show up, but something inside you hesitates. There is a quiet resistance that was not there before, and that resistance is not selfishness. It is the mind trying to protect itself. But instead of listening to that signal, most people push through it. They tell themselves that caring means never holding back, that love means always being available, that compassion means giving no matter the cost. And so they continue, even when they feel tired, even when they feel empty, even when something inside them is asking for rest. This is where compassion turns into suffering, not because compassion is wrong, but because it has been separated from wisdom. There is a teaching in Buddhism that speaks about the middle path, a way of living that avoids extremes, not too much, not too little, a balance that allows energy to flow without depletion. But when it comes to giving, many people live at one extreme. They give too much, too quickly, too often, and without realizing it, they begin to lose the ability to feel the difference between genuine compassion and compulsive overgiving. Because there is a difference. Genuine compassion feels steady. It does not rush. It does not demand. It does not ignore the self. It moves with awareness, choosing when to step forward and when to step back. Compulsive overgiving feels different. It feels urgent. It feels automatic. It feels like something you must do, not something you choose to do. And that urgency is not coming from love. It is coming from fear. Fear of being seen as uncaring, fear of losing connection, fear of disappointing others. So instead of pausing to check what is true for you, you act, you respond, you give. And each time you do, you move a little further away from balance. At first, the consequences are small, a little fatigue, a little frustration. But over time, those small feelings begin to grow. Because the body and mind keep track of what is being ignored. Every time you give beyond your limit, a quiet message is stored inside you. A message that says, "My needs do not matter as much." And when that message repeats often enough, it becomes a belief that shapes how you live, a belief that keeps you trapped in patterns that slowly drain you. This is why exhaustion is not just physical, it is emotional, it is mental, it is the weight of carrying more than you were ever meant to hold. But here is the part that changes everything. You are not required to suffer in order to be compassionate. You are not required to give endlessly in order to be kind. True compassion does not destroy the one who offers it. It includes the giver as much as the receiver. This is where Buddhist wisdom gently redirects the mind. It teaches that compassion without awareness becomes attachment, and attachment always leads to suffering. Because attachment holds on, it refuses to let go. It insists on being involved, even when stepping back would be healthier. So the practice becomes learning to care without clinging, to support without absorbing, to give without losing yourself. This does not mean becoming distant. It does not mean becoming cold. It means becoming clear. Clear about where you end and others begin. Clear about what you can offer and what you cannot. Clear about the difference between helping and overextending. And that clarity changes everything, because once you see it, you begin to make different choices. You begin to pause before saying yes. You begin to check in with your own energy. You begin to notice when giving feels light and when it feels heavy, and slowly you start to trust those signals. You start to understand that discomfort is not something to ignore. It is something to listen to. Because discomfort often appears when boundaries are being crossed, not by others alone, but by yourself. Each time you override your own limits, you create a small fracture inside, and those fractures, over time, become exhaustion. But when you begin to honor your limits, something shifts. Giving becomes lighter, more intentional, more meaningful, because it is no longer forced. It is chosen. There is also a quiet freedom in realizing that you are not responsible for fixing everything, that not every problem needs your involvement, that not every emotional weight needs to pass through you. This understanding does not reduce your compassion, it refines it. It allows you to offer presence without becoming overwhelmed, to listen without carrying, to care without collapsing. And this is where true compassion lives. Not in endless giving, but in balanced giving. Not in constant involvement, but in conscious involvement. Not in losing yourself, but in remaining grounded while you support others. Over time, this balance begins to restore your energy. You feel less drained, less reactive, less overwhelmed, because your compassion is no longer scattered. It is centered. It flows from a place of stability, not depletion. And from that place, something beautiful happens. You begin to enjoy giving again, not as a duty but as a natural expression of who you are, because now your kindness is supported by wisdom, and wisdom protects your peace. This is the difference most people never learn, but once you see it, you cannot go back. You begin to understand that suffering was never the price of love. It was the result of imbalance. And balance is something you can return to. One choice at a time, one boundary at a time, one moment of awareness at a time, and as this understanding deepens, another layer begins to reveal itself. Because beneath the pattern of overgiving, there is often something even more personal, something that quietly drives the need to give in the first place. A hidden force that turns kindness into compulsion. And once you see that, you begin to understand your exhaustion in a completely new way. And as that awareness deepens, something even more personal begins to surface. It is no longer just about how you give or how often you say yes. It becomes a question that feels a little more uncomfortable, a little more honest. What if part of your giving was never only about helping? What if beneath the kindness, There was a quiet need you never fully noticed. There is a feeling many people carry but rarely speak about. A subtle pull inside the chest, almost invisible, yet powerful enough to shape how they show up in every relationship. It does not shout, it whispers. It tells you that being needed means being valuable, that being chosen means being safe, that being important in someone's life is the only way to stay close. And without realizing it, that feeling begins to guide your actions. This is where the craving to be needed begins. It does not look like a craving at first. It looks like generosity. It looks like loyalty. It looks like devotion. You show up for people. You anticipate their needs. You offer help before they even ask. You become the one they rely on, the one they turn to, the one they cannot easily replace. There is a quiet satisfaction in that role, a sense of purpose, a sense of identity, because when someone needs you, it feels like proof that you matter. But over time, something begins to change. The same role that once felt meaningful starts to feel heavy. The same responsibility that once gave you purpose begins to drain your energy. And the strange part is, nothing outside has changed. The same people, the same patterns, the same actions. What has changed is the weight of it. Because when giving is tied to the need to be needed, it stops being free. It becomes conditional, not in a way that is obvious, but in a way that is deeply internal. You begin to give not only because you want to, but because you feel you must. Because if you stop, something feels at risk. Connection might weaken, attention might fade, you might become less important, and that fear keeps the cycle going, even when you are tired, even when you are overwhelmed, even when your body and mind are asking you to slow down. You keep giving because it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like a requirement. This is where emotional burnout begins to take root, not from love itself, but from the attachment hidden inside it. In Buddhist, understanding craving is one of the core sources of suffering. Not just craving for things, but craving for feelings, for identities, for states of being. And one of the most subtle forms of craving is the desire to feel necessary. Because it does not look selfish, it looks noble. But its effect is the same as any other attachment. It binds you, it creates dependency. It ties your sense of worth to something outside of you. So instead of being grounded in your own presence, your value begins to depend on how much others need you. And that is an unstable foundation, because people's needs change, their attention shifts, their lives move in directions you cannot control. And when your identity is built on being needed, every change begins to feel like a loss. So you hold on tighter, you give more, you try harder to stay relevant in their lives, not realizing that this effort is slowly draining the very energy you need to feel whole. There is also a quiet fear beneath this pattern, a fear that if you are not needed, you might be forgotten. That if you are not the one who solves problems, listens deeply, or carries emotional weight, you might not have a place. So you become indispensable, not just to others, but to the role itself, and that role becomes your identity. But here is the truth that begins to free you. Being needed is not the same as being loved. Being important in someone's problems is not the same as being valued for who you are. And when these two are confused, giving becomes a way of securing something that cannot be secured through effort. Because love that depends on how much you give is not stable. It requires constant maintenance, constant proof, constant presence, and that constant effort is what exhausts the heart. You begin to notice moments where you feel empty, even after helping someone. Moments where the satisfaction fades quickly, leaving behind a strange sense of depletion. That feeling is not random. It is the result of giving from a place of lack instead of wholeness. When giving is driven by the need to feel needed, it takes more than it gives, because each act is carrying an unspoken expectation, an expectation to feel valued, to feel seen, to feel secure. And when those expectations are not fully met, the heart becomes tired. not because it lacks compassion, but because it has been carrying too much weight beneath the surface. Buddhist wisdom gently reveals another way, a way where giving is no longer tied to identity, where compassion flows from fullness, not from a need to prove anything, where your sense of self is not built on how much you are needed, but on the simple awareness that you are already enough. This shift is subtle but powerful. It begins with noticing the moments when you feel the urge to step in, to fix, to offer more than what is asked. And instead of immediately acting, you pause. You ask yourself quietly, is this coming from care or from the need to feel necessary? That question alone begins to change things, because it brings awareness to what was once automatic. And awareness creates space where you can choose differently. You may still help, you may still give, but now it comes from clarity, not from compulsion. There is also a deeper realization that begins to unfold. You begin to understand that people's lives are not meant to revolve around your presence, just as your life is not meant to revolve around theirs. Each person walks their own path, carries their own lessons, and grows through their own experiences. When you try to make yourself essential to that process, you step into a role that was never yours to carry, and that role is heavy, because it is built on the illusion that you are responsible for something that is beyond your control. Letting go of that illusion does not reduce your importance, it restores your freedom. You begin to see that you can be present without being central. You can care without being the solution. You can be part of someone's life without being the reason it functions. And that understanding lightens something inside you, because you no longer have to prove your place. You no longer have to maintain your relevance through constant giving. You can simply exist. And from that place, something beautiful begins to happen. Your relationships start to feel different, less pressured, less dependent, more natural, because they are no longer built on the need to be needed, but on the simple presence of being. And that presence is enough. Over time, the craving softens, not because you forced it to disappear, but because you no longer feed it. You no longer chase the feeling of being necessary. You no longer attach your worth to how much you are relied on. Instead, you begin to rest in something more stable, a quiet sense of self that does not depend on external validation. And from that place, your compassion becomes lighter, freer, more sustainable, because it is no longer carrying the weight of identity. It is simply an expression of who you are, and that changes everything. You give when it feels right. You step back when it is needed. You remain connected without losing yourself, and the exhaustion that once followed you begins to fade. Not because you stopped caring, but because you started caring differently, with awareness, with balance, with a sense of inner grounding that does not need constant reinforcement. And as this becomes clearer, another layer begins to reveal itself. Because when the need to be needed shapes your actions for long enough, it does something even deeper. It begins to define who you believe you are, and that identity can become another source of quiet suffering if it is never questioned. And as that quiet shift begins to settle, something deeper starts to reveal itself, something that feels less like a habit and more like a foundation. It is no longer just about why you give, or even the hidden need beneath it. It becomes something more personal, more defining, a question that many people avoid without realizing it. If you stopped helping for a moment, who would you be? There is a strange silence that appears when that question is asked. Not an external silence, but an internal one. A pause where the mind does not immediately respond because for a long time the answer has been the same. You are the one who helps. You are the one who fixes. You are the one who listens, carries, advises, and rescues. That is who you have been. That is how people know you. That is how you know yourself. And slowly, without ever deciding it consciously, service becomes identity. It no longer feels like something you do. It feels like who you are. At first, this identity feels strong. It gives you direction. It gives you a role. It gives you a place in the lives of others. You are needed, you are trusted, you are relied on. There is something deeply comforting about that, because identity brings certainty, and certainty feels safe. But what most people do not see is the cost hidden inside that safety. When your identity is built around being the one who gives, something else begins to disappear. The part of you that exists outside of that role, the part of you that is not defined by usefulness, the part of you that does not need to fix anything to have value. That part slowly fades into the background, not because it is gone, but because it is no longer being seen. Every time you step into the role of the helper, you reinforce it. Every time someone comes to you with a problem and you immediately respond, you strengthen that identity. And over time, it becomes automatic. You no longer ask yourself if you want to help. You simply do, because that is who you are. Or at least, who you believe you are. But something begins to happen when identity becomes too narrow. It starts to limit you. It starts to trap you in patterns that feel difficult to break. Because stepping outside of that identity feels like losing something important. If you are not the helper, then who are you? If you are not the one people turn to, then what is your place? This is where quiet anxiety begins to grow. Not always consciously, but subtly. A fear that if you change, if you step back, if you stop being the one who carries everything, you might lose your sense of self. So you hold on, even when it drains you, even when it exhausts you, even when something inside you is asking for space. You continue to act from that identity, and the more you act from it, the harder it becomes to see yourself beyond it. In Buddhist understanding, this is where the concept of non-self begins to offer clarity. Non-self does not mean that you do not exist. It means that what you think of as yourself is not fixed. It is not permanent. It is not limited to one role, one pattern, one identity. But when you attach to a single identity too strongly, you begin to believe that it is all you are. And that belief creates suffering, because life is not static. People change, situations change, roles change. And when your identity cannot adapt, it begins to feel heavy, rigid, restrictive. This is what happens when service becomes identity. You feel responsible not just for helping, but for being the helper. You feel obligated to maintain that role, even when it no longer fits. And stepping away from it feels like stepping into uncertainty. But that uncertainty is not something to fear. It is something to explore, because within it, there is space. Space to rediscover parts of yourself that have been quiet for a long time, parts that were not needed, so they were set aside. Parts that do not revolve around solving problems or carrying emotional weight. And reconnecting with those parts is not selfish, it is necessary. Because without that connection, your identity becomes unbalanced. It leans entirely outward, focused on others, while neglecting the inner world. And when the inner world is neglected, exhaustion follows. Not just because of what you do, but because of what you are not allowing yourself to be. There is also a deeper layer to this identity, a sense of control. When you are the one who helps, you feel like you are contributing to the stability of situations. You feel like you are making things better, and in many ways, you are. But when that role becomes central to your identity, it creates an illusion that your presence is what holds things together. And that illusion can be dangerous, because it places a weight on you that is not yours to carry. It makes you feel responsible for outcomes that are beyond your control. It makes you feel like stepping back might cause things to fall apart. So you stay involved, even when it is not necessary, even when it is not healthy. But the truth is, people's lives are not held together by your constant involvement. They have their own paths, their own strength, their own capacity to navigate their challenges. And when you make yourself central to that process, you unintentionally limit both yourself and them. You limit yourself by staying in a role that drains you, and you limit them by not allowing them to fully experience their own growth. Letting go of that role is not abandonment. It is trust. Trust in others, trust in life, and most importantly, trust in yourself. Trust that you are more than one identity. Trust that your value does not disappear when you stop being useful in the same way. Trust that there is a version of you that exists beyond helping, and that version deserves to be known. This is where non-self becomes freeing, because it reminds you that you are not confined to one way of being. You are not required to stay the same. You are allowed to evolve, to step out of roles that no longer serve you, to explore who you are without the constant need to give. And that exploration can feel unfamiliar at first. You may notice moments of discomfort, moments where you do not know how to respond because your usual role is no longer guiding you. But those moments are important. They are spaces where something new can emerge, a sense of self that is not tied to performance, not tied to usefulness, not tied to how much you can carry. A self that simply exists, present, aware, whole. From that place, your actions begin to change. You may still help, you may still give, but it is no longer coming from identity, it is coming from choice. And that difference changes everything. Because when giving is no longer who you are, but something you choose, it becomes lighter, more flexible, more sustainable. You are no longer trapped in a role. You are moving freely, responding to situations without losing yourself in them. And this freedom allows something else to return. A sense of curiosity, a sense of presence, a sense of connection to your own experience. You begin to notice what you enjoy, what you need, what brings you peace, things that were once overshadowed by the constant focus on others. And as you reconnect with those things, your energy begins to restore. Not because you stopped caring, but because you stopped defining yourself solely through caring. You begin to understand that your existence is not a function. It is not a role to be performed. It is something deeper, something that does not need to be justified through action. And from that understanding, a new balance emerges. One where you can be present for others without being consumed by their needs. One where you can offer support without losing your sense of self. One where your identity is not fixed, but fluid, adapting, growing, evolving. This is the quiet power of releasing identity, not by rejecting it, but by loosening your grip on it, allowing yourself to be more than what you have been. And as this becomes clearer, another layer begins to unfold. Because even when you begin to loosen identity, there is still something else that can quietly pull you back into exhaustion. Something that does not come from roles or expectations, but from something more subtle. Something that lives in the way you feel other people's pain. And once you see that, you begin to understand why even stepping back sometimes does not fully restore your energy. And even as that identity begins to loosen, even as you slowly step out of the role that once defined you, something still lingers beneath the surface, a quiet weight that does not disappear, just because you are doing less. A heaviness that follows you even when you finally sit still. Because the exhaustion was never only about what you were doing, it was also about what you were carrying. There is a kind of tiredness that does not come from action, but from absorption. It settles into the body without asking permission. It moves through the mind without making a sound. And before you notice it, it begins to feel like it belongs to you. But it doesn't. It never did. There is a subtle habit that forms when you spend a long time being present for others. You begin to listen deeply, not just to words, but to emotions. You sense tension, fear, sadness, confusion. You read between lines, you notice what is not being said, and at first, this sensitivity feels like a gift. It allows you to connect, to understand, to respond in ways that feel meaningful. But over time, something shifts. You stop observing emotions, and you start holding them. You stop witnessing pain, and you begin to absorb it. Someone shares their anxiety, and hours later, you still feel unsettled. Someone opens up about their sadness, and it lingers in your chest long after the conversation ends. Someone expresses confusion or fear, and it quietly becomes part of your inner state. It happens so naturally that you do not question it. You assume this is what it means to care, to feel what others feel, to carry it with them. But this is where the line begins to blur, because feeling with someone is not the same as carrying what they feel. And when that difference is not clear, your inner world begins to fill with things that were never yours. This is the exhaustion of carrying pain that was never meant to live inside you. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It accumulates slowly, a little here, a little there, until your mind becomes crowded with emotions that do not have a clear source. You feel tired, but you cannot explain why. You feel heavy, but nothing in your own life seems to justify it. And that confusion adds another layer to the exhaustion. Because you start searching for reasons within yourself. You question your strength, your resilience, your ability to handle life, not realizing that much of what you are holding does not belong to your experience. In Buddhist understanding, there is a deep awareness of how the mind interacts with the world. It teaches that we can observe without attaching, feel without clinging, and be present without absorbing. But when awareness is not cultivated, the mind does something else. It identifies, it takes what it encounters and makes it personal. So when you encounter someone's pain, your mind does not just witness it, it internalizes it. It begins to treat it as part of your own emotional landscape. And over time, that landscape becomes overwhelming, because it is filled with layers of fear, sadness, tension, and uncertainty that are not rooted in your own life. This is why rest does not always restore you, because you are not only resting from your own experiences, you are resting from everything you have unconsciously taken in, and the body keeps track of this. There is a quiet intelligence in the body that notices what the mind ignores. Every time you absorb something heavy, the body registers it. It tightens slightly. Breathing becomes a little more shallow. Muscles hold a little more tension. And these small changes accumulate until the body begins to feel tired, even when there is no clear reason. This is why emotional exhaustion often feels physical, because it is not just in your thoughts. It is in your nervous system. It is in the way your body has been holding what it was never meant to carry. There is also a deeper pattern beneath this absorption, a belief that being deeply affected by others is a sign of care, that if you do not feel their pain strongly, you are not being compassionate enough, so you allow yourself to feel everything. You open completely, you do not filter, you do not step back, and while this openness comes from a sincere place, it lacks something important. It lacks separation, not separation as distance, but separation as clarity. Clarity about where your experience ends and another person's begins. Without that clarity, your boundaries dissolve, and when boundaries dissolve, everything flows in, not just the good, but the heavy, the unresolved, the chaotic, and eventually, your inner space begins to reflect the emotional weight of everyone around you. This is not sustainable, because you are not designed to process multiple emotional realities at once. Your mind and body are built to experience your life, not to carry fragments of everyone else's. This is where Buddhist practice introduces a different approach. It teaches the art of witnessing, being present with someone's pain without taking ownership of it, allowing emotions to be seen, acknowledged, and understood, without bringing them inside as something you must hold. This is not indifference. It is clarity. It is the understanding that each person's emotions belong to their path, their experiences, their process. You can support that process. You can sit beside it, but you do not need to carry it. Learning this takes time, because the habit of absorption is often deeply rooted. It is built through years of being the one who listens, who cares, who stays present no matter what. But slowly, with awareness, something begins to change. You start to notice the moment when an emotion is entering your space. You start to feel the shift in your body, the change in your breathing, the subtle tension that appears. And instead of allowing it to settle inside you, you pause. You acknowledge it. You let it exist, without attaching it to yourself. This is a small shift, but it has a powerful effect, because each time you do this, you prevent something from becoming part of your internal load. You create space where your own energy can remain intact, space where your mind can stay clear, and over time, that space becomes your foundation. You begin to feel lighter, not because the world has less pain, but because you are no longer carrying what is not yours. There is also a quiet relief in realizing that you do not have to feel everything deeply to care deeply. That compassion does not require you to suffer alongside others. It requires you to be present, aware, and supportive, without losing yourself, without absorbing what belongs to someone else's journey. This understanding changes how you move through relationships. You listen differently, you engage differently, you remain open, but you are no longer porous. You allow connection, but you protect your inner space. And that protection is not selfish. It is necessary, because without it, your ability to care becomes compromised. Not because you lack compassion, but because you have been overwhelmed by what you have taken in. As this becomes clearer, your energy begins to return. Slowly, gently, you feel more grounded, more present, less scattered. Because your inner world is no longer crowded with borrowed emotions, it becomes your own again, a space where you can breathe, where you can rest, where you can exist without carrying unseen weight. And from that place, your compassion becomes stronger, not weaker, because it is no longer draining you. It is flowing through you, without attachment, without absorption, without loss. And as this awareness deepens, something else begins to rise to the surface. Because even when you stop carrying what is not yours, there are still emotions within you that have been building quietly. Emotions that did not come from others, but from within. Feelings that were never fully expressed, never fully acknowledged. And once you begin to create space inside yourself, those feelings begin to speak. And what they reveal can be surprising. And as that space begins to open, as your inner world slowly becomes lighter, something unexpected starts to rise. It does not feel peaceful at first. It does not feel calm or clear. It feels uncomfortable, almost out of place. Because beneath the tiredness, beneath the heaviness you thought was only exhaustion, there is something else waiting. Something that has been quiet for a long time. Something you may have never allowed yourself to fully see. A tension that has no clear voice, yet carries a strong presence. It shows up in small reactions. A short reply, a sudden irritation, a moment where patience disappears faster than expected, and then, just as quickly, it is pushed down again, hidden beneath the same familiar thought. I shouldn't feel this way. There is a kind of anger that does not look like anger. It does not shout. It does not explode. It does not demand attention. Instead, it stays beneath the surface, layered under politeness, understanding, and self-control. It is quiet, but it is there. This is the silent anger beneath selfless giving. It forms slowly, almost invisibly, in the background of a life built on always being there for others. Every time you say yes when you want to say no, a small part of that anger takes shape. Every time you ignore your own limits to meet someone else's needs, it grows a little stronger. Every time you feel unseen, unappreciated, or taken for granted, but choose to stay silent, it settles deeper inside. It does not disappear just because you do not express it. It accumulates, layer by layer, moment by moment, until it becomes part of your emotional landscape. The reason it remains hidden is because it does not match the identity you have built. You see yourself as kind, patient, understanding, someone who gives without expecting anything in return, someone who is above anger, above frustration, above resentment. So when these feelings appear, they feel wrong, unacceptable. They do not fit the image you hold of yourself, so instead of allowing them, you suppress them. You push them down, you cover them with more kindness, more patience, more giving. But suppression does not remove anger, it only buries it, and buried emotions do not stay still. They find other ways to express themselves. They show up in subtle ways, a sense of irritation that lingers longer than it should, a feeling of being overwhelmed by small requests, a quiet resistance when someone asks for your help again, a heaviness that follows interactions that once felt natural. These are not signs that you have become less caring. They are signs that something inside you has been ignored for too long. Because anger, at its core, is not the problem. It is a signal, a message, an indicator that something within you is not aligned, that your boundaries have been crossed, that your needs have been overlooked, that your energy has been stretched beyond what is sustainable. But when you refuse to acknowledge that signal, it does not guide you, it weighs on you, it turns inward, and that inward tension becomes exhaustion. This is why burnout often feels confusing, because on the surface, you are still doing the same things, helping, supporting, giving, but underneath, something has changed. There is less lightness, less joy, less willingness, and more resistance, more tension, more quiet frustration. Buddhist awareness invites you to look at this without judgment, not to label anger as bad or wrong, but to understand it, to see it clearly, without trying to push it away or hide it. Because when you meet anger with awareness, something shifts. It stops being something you are afraid of and becomes something you can learn from. Instead of asking, "Why do I feel this way?" with frustration, you begin to ask with curiosity, "What is this trying to show me?" And that question opens a different kind of understanding. You start to see patterns, moments where you gave more than you had, times when you stayed silent instead of expressing what you needed, situations where you allowed others to rely on you in ways that were not balanced. And through this seeing, the anger begins to make sense. It is no longer random. It is no longer something to be ashamed of. It becomes a reflection of your own experience, a reflection of how often you have stepped beyond your own limits. There is also a deeper layer to this anger, a sense of unfairness, not always directed at others, but sometimes directed inward. A quiet realization that you have been giving without receiving the same level of care, that you have been holding space for others while no one has held the same space for you. And that realization can be painful, because it reveals something you may not have wanted to see, that your way of giving has not always been balanced, that you have been expecting others to understand your needs without expressing them, that you have been hoping your efforts would be recognized without ever asking to be seen. And when those hopes are not met, the disappointment turns into resentment, not because others are intentionally neglecting you, but because your needs have remained unspoken. This is where Buddhist practice offers a different approach. It encourages honesty, not harsh honesty, but gentle, clear awareness, the kind of awareness that allows you to see your own patterns without blame, to recognize where you have contributed to your own exhaustion, not as a form of self-criticism, but as a path to understanding. Because once you understand, you can begin to change. You can begin to express what you need, to set limits without guilt, to allow yourself to feel anger without immediately suppressing it, not to act on it blindly, but to listen to what it is pointing toward. And often, what it is pointing toward is simple. You have been giving too much without caring for yourself. You have been prioritizing others at the cost of your own well-being. You have been ignoring your own limits for the sake of maintaining harmony. And that harmony has come at a price: your energy, your peace, your sense of balance. Seeing this clearly is not easy, because it challenges the identity you have built. The image of being endlessly patient, endlessly giving, endlessly strong. But that image is not sustainable, because it does not include the full truth of your experience. It does not include your needs, your limits, your emotions. And when those parts are excluded, they find ways to return, through anger, through exhaustion, through moments of quiet resistance that you cannot ignore forever. Allowing anger to be seen does not mean acting out of it. It means creating space for it, letting it exist without judgment, observing it without immediately trying to fix it. And through that observation, understanding begins to unfold. You begin to see where boundaries are needed, where communication is necessary, where change must happen. And slowly, the anger loses its intensity. Not because it has been suppressed again, but because it has been understood, because its message has been heard, its purpose fulfilled, and in its place, something else begins to emerge: clarity. A clearer sense of what you can offer, what you cannot, what feels aligned, what does not. This clarity allows your actions to become more intentional. You no longer give automatically. You choose. You respond from awareness, not from habit. And in that choice, your energy begins to stabilize. You feel less tension, less inner conflict, because your actions are no longer contradicting your needs. They are aligned with them. And that alignment brings a different kind of peace. A peace that is not dependent on being perfect or endlessly patient, but on being honest. Honest with yourself, honest about your limits, honest about your emotions, including the ones you once avoided. Because those emotions were never the enemy. They were signals, guides, indicators of where balance was needed. And once you learn to listen to them, they no longer need to shout. They no longer need to build up beneath the surface. They become part of your awareness, part of your understanding, part of the way you navigate your relationships and your inner world. And as this understanding deepens, another layer begins to reveal itself. Because beyond anger, beyond exhaustion, beyond the patterns of giving and holding, there is still something shaping your experience, something even more subtle, a belief that quietly influences how you see yourself, a belief about what it means to be good. And once you begin to question that belief, you start to see how deeply it has been guiding your actions all along. And as that clarity settles, as you begin to understand your anger instead of hiding it, another truth quietly steps forward. It is softer, less obvious, but just as powerful. Because beneath the patterns, beneath the giving, beneath the exhaustion and even the anger, there is a belief that has been shaping everything. A belief that feels right, almost unquestionable. The belief that you must be good, not just good in a simple way, but consistently kind, always generous, endlessly patient, dependable no matter the cost, the kind of person who does not disappoint, who does not withdraw, who does not say no too often, who does not make others uncomfortable. And because this belief feels noble, it is rarely challenged. But something inside you already senses the tension it creates. There is a quiet pressure that comes with trying to always be that version of yourself, a pressure that does not allow rest, a pressure that does not allow mistakes, a pressure that quietly tells you that your worth depends on how well you maintain that image. This is where the attachment to being good begins to shape your inner world. At first, it feels like a guide. It helps you act with care, with awareness, with intention. It keeps you from harming others. It encourages generosity and patience. But slowly, it becomes something else. It becomes a standard you feel you must constantly meet. And when something becomes a standard instead of a choice, it starts to create tension. Because life does not always allow you to be everything at once. There are moments when you feel tired, when your patience is limited, when your energy is low, when your needs are asking for attention. But the attachment to being good does not consider those moments. It expects consistency. It expects you to show up the same way, no matter how you feel. So you override yourself. You ignore your tiredness. You silence your discomfort. You push through your limits, all to maintain that image. And each time you do this, a quiet conflict forms inside you. A conflict between what you feel and how you believe you should act. This conflict is subtle, but it is constant. It is the space where exhaustion begins to deepen, because you are not only giving your energy, you are also suppressing your truth. And suppression always has a cost. It does not disappear. It turns inward. It creates tension. It builds pressure, until even the smallest interactions begin to feel heavy. Not because they are difficult, but because you are carrying more than what is visible. The attachment to being good also creates a kind of fear, a fear of being seen differently, a fear of disappointing others, a fear that if you do not meet expectations, you might lose something important: respect, connection, approval. So you maintain the image, even when it drains you, even when it no longer feels natural, even when something inside you is asking for change. This is where the spiritual trap forms, because what started as genuine kindness becomes something rigid, something that limits you, something that does not allow flexibility. In Buddhist understanding, attachment is not only about holding on to things, but also about holding on to identities. And the identity of being good can become one of the strongest attachments, because it feels right. It feels safe. It feels like something you should not question. But any identity that you feel you must protect at all times will eventually create suffering, because it does not allow you to be fully human. It does not allow you to feel everything, to express everything, to respond naturally to what arises within you. Instead, it filters your experience through a constant question. Is this good enough? Is this kind enough? Is this acceptable? And that constant evaluation creates pressure. It turns simple moments into decisions. It turns natural responses into calculations. And over time, it disconnects you from your own authenticity, because you are no longer acting from what you feel. You are acting from what you believe you should be. There is also a quiet exhaustion in always being dependable, always being the one who shows up, always being the one who can be counted on. Because it leaves little room for you to not be okay, to not have the energy, to not have the capacity. It creates an unspoken expectation that you will always be available in the same way. And that expectation becomes something you carry, even when no one explicitly asks for it. You carry it within yourself, you hold yourself to it, and that self-imposed pressure is often stronger than anything others place on you. This is why stepping back feels so difficult, not because others will necessarily react negatively, but because it challenges the identity you have built. It feels like breaking a rule, like stepping outside something that has defined you for so long. But that discomfort is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is a sign that you are loosening an attachment. And attachments rarely release without resistance, because they have become familiar. They have become part of how you see yourself. Letting go of the need to always be good does not mean becoming careless or unkind. It means allowing yourself to be real, to respond with awareness instead of obligation, to act from presence instead of pressure. There is a difference between kindness that flows naturally and kindness that is performed. One feels light, the other feels heavy. One restores energy, the other drains it. When you are attached to being good, your actions begin to carry weight because they are tied to your identity. They are not just choices, they are proofs. Proof that you are who you believe you must be. And that need for proof creates exhaustion because it never ends. There is always another moment, another situation, another expectation to meet. But when you begin to loosen that attachment, something shifts. You start to act without needing to prove anything. You start to give without needing validation. You start to care without needing recognition. And in that shift, your energy begins to return, because you are no longer carrying the extra weight of maintaining an image. You are simply being present, responding to life as it unfolds, allowing your actions to come from awareness, not from a fixed identity. There is also a quiet freedom in allowing yourself to not always be the same, to have moments where you are less patient, moments where you need space, moments where you say no without explaining. These moments do not make you less kind. They make you more honest, more balanced, more aligned with your actual experience. And that alignment is what restores inner peace. Because peace does not come from being perfect. It comes from being authentic, from not fighting against what you feel, from not forcing yourself into a shape that no longer fits. Buddhist teaching often speaks about letting go, not as an act of rejection, but as an act of understanding, seeing clearly what is causing suffering and gently releasing it. The attachment to being good is one of those things. It is not wrong. It is not something to judge. But it is something to see clearly, to understand how it has shaped your actions, how it has influenced your decisions, how it has contributed to your exhaustion. And once you see it clearly, you no longer need to hold on to it in the same way. You can still be kind, still be generous, still be caring, but now it comes from choice, not from attachment, not from pressure, not from the need to maintain an image. And that difference changes everything, because your actions become lighter, more natural, more aligned with your actual energy and capacity. You give when you can. You rest when you need. You engage when it feels right, and step back when it does not. There is no longer a constant need to measure yourself, to evaluate whether you are good enough, because you are no longer defining yourself through that lens. You are simply present, aware, responsive. And in that presence, peace begins to grow. Not as something you chase, but as something that naturally arises when there is no longer tension between who you are and who you believe you should be. This is the quiet transformation that happens when you release the attachment to being good. You do not lose your kindness, you rediscover it, in a form that is sustainable, in a form that does not exhaust you, in a form that allows you to care without losing yourself. And as this understanding settles, another layer begins to unfold. Because even when you begin to act from clarity, there is still something that can blur the line between caring and losing yourself. Something that feels like connection, but slowly becomes entanglement. And once you begin to see that difference clearly, your relationships begin to change in a way you may not have expected. And as that inner pressure begins to loosen, as you stop trying to prove your goodness and start acting from something more honest, another realization quietly begins to form. It is subtle, but once you see it, it changes how you understand every relationship in your life. Because caring is not the problem. The way you have been connecting might be. There is a moment, often overlooked, where connection starts to blur. A moment where being present for someone slowly turns into something heavier. Something that no longer feels like support, but like involvement at a level that begins to pull you inward. It does not happen suddenly. It happens gradually. A conversation becomes a responsibility. A feeling becomes something you carry. A situation becomes something you feel you must manage. And without realizing it, you cross a line that is rarely talked about, the line between compassion and emotional enmeshment. There is a quiet intensity to this experience. It feels like closeness. It feels like deep understanding. It feels like being connected in a way that goes beyond the surface. But there is also a cost hidden inside it, because when you are emotionally enmeshed, you are no longer just aware of someone's experience. You are inside it. You are affected by every shift in their mood, every change in their energy, every moment of uncertainty or tension. Their emotional state begins to influence your own, not as an observer, but as a participant. And that participation slowly becomes exhausting. Not because you do not care, but because you are no longer separate. You begin to feel responsible not just for supporting them, but for stabilizing what they feel. If they are anxious, you feel the need to calm them. If they are upset, you feel the need to fix it. If they are lost, you feel the need to guide them. And in that process, your own emotional state becomes tied to theirs. This is where enmeshment quietly takes hold. It is not obvious. It does not announce itself, but it reshapes your inner experience. You begin to lose the ability to feel your emotions independently. Your peace becomes conditional, dependent on how others are doing. If they are okay, you feel relief. If they are not, something inside you tightens, and this creates a constant fluctuation in your energy, a sense of instability that is difficult to explain, because it is not coming from your own life alone. It is coming from multiple emotional currents that you have allowed yourself to enter. In Buddhist understanding, there is a clear distinction between compassion and attachment. Compassion sees suffering and responds with care. Attachment becomes entangled with that suffering and loses clarity. Emotional enmeshment is a form of attachment. It is the loss of that clear boundary between your experience and someone else's. And while it may feel like deep connection, it often leads to confusion, because you begin to carry emotions that are not rooted in your own reality. This is why you may feel overwhelmed, even when nothing in your life seems overwhelming, because your inner world is no longer just yours. It is influenced by the emotional states of others. And the more sensitive you are, the more this effect grows. Sensitivity itself is not the problem. It is the lack of separation that creates the strain. Without separation, every emotion becomes personal. Every shift becomes something you must respond to, and that constant responsiveness leads to exhaustion. Buddhist teachings offer a different approach, an approach that does not reduce compassion, but refines it. It introduces the idea of detachment. But detachment is often misunderstood. It is seen as cold, distant, or uncaring, something that removes warmth from relationships. But true detachment is not about withdrawing from others. It is about maintaining clarity within yourself. It is the ability to be fully present without losing your center, to feel with someone without becoming them, to understand their experience without absorbing it. This kind of clarity allows compassion to remain steady, because it is not affected by the fluctuations of others. It does not rise and fall based on someone else's emotional state. It remains grounded, balanced, sustainable. This is what prevents exhaustion, because your energy is no longer being pulled in different directions. You are not trying to manage what is not yours. You are not taking responsibility for things beyond your control. Instead, you are offering something simpler but more powerful. Presence, not intervention, not control, just presence. And presence has a different quality. It does not rush. It does not try to fix everything immediately. It allows space for others to feel what they feel, for situations to unfold naturally, for growth to happen without interference. This does not mean you stop helping. It means you help in a way that does not compromise your own stability. You remain aware of your own state. You notice when your energy begins to shift, when your emotions begin to mirror someone else's too closely, and instead of following that shift, you return to yourself, to your breath, to your body, to the awareness that you are here, separate, grounded. This return is subtle, but it changes everything, because it restores balance. It allows you to stay connected without being consumed. There is also a deeper trust that begins to develop, a trust that others are capable of navigating their own experiences, that they do not need you to carry their emotions in order to be supported, that your role is not to merge with their chaos, but to stand beside them with clarity. This trust removes a great deal of pressure, because you no longer feel the need to manage outcomes. You no longer feel responsible for how things unfold. You offer what you can, and you allow the rest to be. And in that allowing, your energy is preserved. Your mind remains clear. Your body remains at ease. You are not constantly reacting to emotional shifts. You are observing them, responding when needed, stepping back when necessary. This balance creates a different kind of connection, one that is not based on intensity, but on stability, one that does not require you to lose yourself in order to be present, one that allows both you and the other person to remain whole. Over time, this changes how you experience relationships. They feel lighter, less draining, more natural, because they are no longer built on enmeshment. They are built on awareness, on mutual space, on the understanding that each person has their own emotional world, and that those worlds do not need to merge in order to connect. This understanding also reduces the quiet anxiety that often accompanies enmeshment, the feeling that you must always be alert, always ready to respond, always aware of how others are feeling, because you are no longer carrying that responsibility. You are present but not burdened, attentive but not entangled, and this creates a sense of ease that was not there before, a sense that you can breathe fully without being pulled in multiple directions, that your energy belongs to you again, and from that place your compassion becomes stronger, not because you are doing more, but because you are no longer depleting yourself. You are giving from a place of balance, from a place that is not overwhelmed, from a place that can sustain itself over time. This is the quiet power of understanding the difference between compassion and enmeshment. It allows you to remain open without being vulnerable to exhaustion, to stay connected without losing clarity, to care deeply without carrying what is not yours. And as this understanding settles, another layer begins to reveal itself, because even when you learn to separate your emotions from others, there is still something that can quietly pull you back into old patterns, a fear that makes it difficult to step back, a fear that has less to do with others and more to do with how you are seen. And once you begin to see that clearly, you start to understand why saying no has always felt harder than it should. And as that clarity begins to settle, as you learn to stay present without losing yourself, something else quietly steps into view. It is not loud, it does not announce itself as a problem, but it shapes your choices more than you realize. Because even when you understand the difference between caring and losing yourself, even when you feel the need to step back, there is still a force that pulls you forward. A hesitation that appears right at the moment you want to say no, a tightness in your chest when you think about setting a limit, a quiet voice that whispers, "What if they feel hurt?" And before you fully process it, the answer comes out, yes. There is a kind of fear that does not look like fear. It looks like kindness. It looks like consideration. It looks like being thoughtful of others. But beneath it, something else is happening. A deep discomfort with the idea of disappointing someone. This discomfort is subtle but powerful. It shapes your responses in ways that feel automatic. It turns simple decisions into emotional dilemmas. It makes boundaries feel like threats instead of acts of care. And over time, it becomes a form of quiet bondage, because you are no longer choosing freely. You are choosing based on avoidance, avoidance of discomfort, avoidance of conflict, avoidance of being seen as someone who might say no. This is where emotional exhaustion begins to grow in a different way, not from what you are doing, but from what you feel you cannot do. You cannot refuse, you cannot withdraw, you cannot allow others to experience even a moment of disappointment, and so you continue saying yes, even when your energy is low. You continue showing up, even when your mind is asking for rest. You continue giving, even when something inside you is quietly pulling back. And each time you override that inner signal, something shifts. not outside, but inside. A small tension forms, a quiet resistance, a feeling that you are not fully aligned with your own choice. But that feeling is pushed aside, because the priority is not your comfort, it is theirs. This is where the pattern deepens, because the more you avoid disappointing others, the more you begin to neglect yourself. And the more you neglect yourself, the more exhaustion takes hold. There is also a deeper layer to this fear, a belief that disappointment equals disconnection, that if you say no, something will change, that the relationship might weaken, that the way you are seen might shift, and that shift feels risky. So instead of taking that risk, you maintain the pattern. You stay agreeable, available, accommodating, even when it costs you. This is where the bondage becomes clear. Not because someone is forcing you, but because you feel unable to act differently. Your choices become limited, not by circumstance, but by fear. And fear has a way of narrowing perception. It makes the discomfort of others feel more important than your own well-being. It makes temporary tension feel like something to avoid at all costs. But in doing so, it creates a different kind of tension, one that builds slowly within you, because each time you avoid disappointing others, you are silently disappointing yourself. And that quiet disappointment accumulates. It does not always appear immediately, but over time it becomes noticeable, a sense of being stretched, a sense of being overextended, a sense of being responsible for maintaining the comfort of everyone around you. And that responsibility is heavy, because it is not yours to carry. In Buddhist understanding, attachment to approval is a common source of suffering, not just the desire to be liked, but the need to avoid being seen negatively. This need creates a constant adjustment in behavior, a constant monitoring of how your actions might be perceived. And that monitoring consumes energy, it creates tension, it prevents natural expression, because you are no longer acting freely. You are acting carefully, strategically, trying to maintain a certain image. And that effort becomes exhausting, because it never stops. There is always another situation, another interaction, another moment where you feel the need to choose between your truth and someone else's comfort. And when you consistently choose their comfort, something within you begins to fade. Your clarity, your sense of direction, your ability to recognize what you actually need, because you are no longer practicing that awareness. You are practicing accommodation. But here is the quiet truth that begins to shift everything. Disappointment is not harm. It is a natural part of human interaction. People will feel things, they will react, they will have expectations that are not always met, and that is not something you can control, nor is it something you are responsible for preventing. Allowing someone to feel temporary discomfort does not make you unkind. It makes you honest. It creates space for authenticity. It allows relationships to be real, not managed. Because when you constantly avoid disappointing others, you are not creating harmony. You are creating an illusion that everything is always okay, that you are always available, that your needs are secondary. And that illusion eventually breaks. Not in a dramatic way, but in a gradual one, through exhaustion, through withdrawal, through moments where you can no longer maintain the same level of giving. And when that happens, the shift can feel sudden to others. But it has been building inside you for a long time. This is why it is important to begin changing the pattern before it reaches that point. To recognize the fear when it appears. To notice the moment when you hesitate, when you feel that pull to say yes, even though something inside you is asking for no. And in that moment, to pause, not to react immediately, but to sit with the discomfort, to allow the possibility that someone might not be pleased, that they might feel disappointed, and to see that as something that can be held, not avoided. This practice is not easy, because it goes against a habit that has likely been reinforced for a long time. But each time you allow that discomfort, something changes. the fear loses a little of its hold. The need to avoid it becomes less urgent, and slowly your choices begin to open up. You begin to act from clarity instead of avoidance. You begin to set limits where they are needed, not as a rejection of others, but as a recognition of yourself. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to form, that relationships do not depend on constant agreement. They depend on honesty, on mutual respect, on the ability to navigate differences without losing connection. And when you allow yourself to be real, even when it creates momentary discomfort, you strengthen that foundation, because you are no longer presenting a version of yourself that is shaped by fear. You are showing up as you are, with your limits, with your needs, with your truth. And that presence is more stable than any agreement built on avoidance. Over time, this changes how you experience connection. It becomes less about maintaining a certain image and more about being present, less about managing emotions and more about allowing them, both yours and others. And in that allowance, there is a sense of ease that was not there before, a sense that you do not have to constantly adjust, constantly monitor, constantly protect others from discomfort, because you trust that relationships can hold that they can move through moments of tension without breaking. And that trust reduces the pressure you carry. It allows your energy to return. It allows your mind to rest, because you are no longer in a constant state of negotiation, trying to balance your needs with everyone else's expectations. You are simply responding to what is true, and that response becomes more natural over time, less forced, less calculated, more aligned. This is where freedom begins to emerge, not as something external, but as something internal, a release from the need to constantly avoid disappointment, a release from the belief that your role is to maintain comfort at all costs. And in that release, your energy begins to stabilize, your exhaustion begins to ease, because you are no longer carrying the weight of everyone else's emotional reactions. You are allowing them to exist without making them your responsibility. And as this understanding deepens, another layer begins to unfold. Because beneath the fear of disappointing others, there is often something even more subtle, a quiet hope that keeps the cycle of giving in motion. A hope that if you continue, if you give enough, if you sacrifice enough, something will finally shift. Something that has been quietly driving your actions all along. And once you begin to see that clearly, your relationship with giving begins to change in a way that feels almost unexpected. And as that fear begins to loosen, as you slowly allow yourself to disappoint others without collapsing inside, something deeper starts to reveal itself. It is not just fear that has been shaping your actions. It is something quieter, something more hidden. A silent expectation, a hope that has been sitting beneath your giving for a very long time. Because even when you tell yourself you expect nothing in return, there is often something unspoken moving underneath, something that does not ask directly but waits patiently. A feeling that says, if I keep showing up like this, something good will come back to me. It is subtle. It does not feel like a transaction, but it is there. There is a quiet weight that comes from giving without knowing why you feel so empty afterward. A confusion that builds slowly, because on the surface, everything looks right. You are kind, you are generous, you are present, and yet something inside you is still waiting for something to come back, waiting for a feeling that never fully arrives. This is where overgiving becomes a subtle bargain with the world. Not a spoken agreement, not something you consciously decided, but something that formed quietly over time. A pattern built from experiences, from moments where giving felt like the only way to receive something important: love, safety, recognition, a sense of belonging. At some point, the mind begins to connect these things. It begins to believe that giving is the path to receiving, so you give. Not just from care, but from hope. Hope that if you give enough, you will be seen. Hope that if you give consistently, you will be chosen. Hope that if you give without hesitation, you will not be left behind. And this hope is powerful. It keeps you moving, it keeps you engaged, it keeps you offering more than you have, because it feels like you are building something, a future where you are valued, where you are secure, where you are finally at ease. But there is something important hidden inside this pattern. The giving is not free. It carries an expectation, not always conscious, but present. An expectation that the world will respond in a certain way, that people will appreciate you, that they will treat you with the same care, that they will not leave. And when those expectations are not met, something shifts, a quiet disappointment, a feeling that something is missing, a sense that you have given so much but received so little in return. This is where the suffering begins, not because you gave, but because of the meaning attached to your giving. Because the moment giving becomes a way to secure something, it stops being unconditional. It becomes a strategy, a way to influence outcomes, a way to create a sense of safety. But life does not operate on these kinds of agreements. People do not always respond in the way you hope. They have their own patterns, their own limitations, their own ways of giving and receiving. And when your inner sense of peace depends on how others respond, it becomes unstable. Because it is no longer rooted in you, it is tied to something outside of your control. This is what makes the bargain so painful, because it is never fully fulfilled. There are moments when it feels like it is working, moments when someone appreciates you, when they respond with warmth, when you feel seen. And in those moments, the belief is reinforced. You feel like your giving is being rewarded, but those moments are not consistent. They come and go. And when they fade, the emptiness returns, stronger, more noticeable, because now there is contrast, now there is a sense of loss. And so you give again, trying to recreate that feeling, trying to secure that response, trying to reach a point where it finally feels stable. But that point never fully arrives, because the bargain itself is built on something fragile. The idea that your worth is something that must be earned through giving. Buddhist wisdom gently reveals the truth behind this pattern. It shows that suffering does not come from giving itself, but from attachment. Attachment to outcomes, attachment to recognition, attachment to the belief that your actions will create a certain response. And when you see this clearly, something begins to shift. You begin to understand that the exhaustion you feel is not just from giving too much. It is from carrying the weight of expectation, the constant hope that your actions will lead to something specific, and the quiet disappointment when they do not. This understanding can feel uncomfortable at first, because it challenges the idea that your giving is purely selfless. It asks you to look deeper, to see the motivations that have been shaping your actions, not to judge them, but to understand them. Because those motivations are not wrong. They come from a natural human desire to feel safe, valued, and connected. But when those desires are placed into a bargain, they become a source of suffering, because they rely on something that cannot be guaranteed. The shift begins when you start to separate your giving from your expectations, when you begin to offer without attaching your sense of worth to the outcome. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you change how you relate to your actions. You give because it feels aligned, not because it will lead to something. You support because you choose to, not because it will secure a certain response. And this change creates a different kind of experience, a lighter one, because there is no longer a hidden pressure, no longer a silent waiting, no longer a need for the world to respond in a certain way. You are no longer negotiating with life, you are participating in it. There is also a deeper realization that begins to unfold, that the things you were hoping to receive cannot be fully given by others in the way you expected. Love that feels stable does not come from constant validation. Safety that feels real does not come from being needed. Value that feels true does not come from how much you give. These things come from within, from a sense of self that is not dependent on external responses. And when that sense begins to develop, the need for the bargain fades, because you are no longer trying to earn something that you already recognize within yourself. This does not happen all at once. It is a gradual shift, a process of noticing when expectation arises. When you feel that quiet hope that something will come back to you, and instead of following it, you pause. You acknowledge it. You let it be there without acting from it. And over time, that space grows. The space between your action and your expectation, the space where freedom begins, because in that space, you are no longer driven by the need to secure something. You are acting from presence, from awareness, from a place that is not trying to control outcomes. And that changes how giving feels. It becomes lighter, more genuine, more aligned with your actual energy. You no longer feel drained in the same way, because you are not carrying the additional weight of expectation. You are simply offering what you can, when you can, and allowing the rest to unfold naturally. There is also a quiet peace in releasing the belief that one more act of giving will finally make everything feel complete. That one more effort will finally bring the recognition you have been waiting for, because once you see that this pattern does not lead to the fulfillment you hoped for, you no longer need to continue it. You can step out of it, not by force but by understanding, by seeing clearly that the bargain itself is what has been creating the cycle of exhaustion. And in that clarity, something softens, the urgency fades, the pressure eases. Because you are no longer trying to achieve something through giving, you are simply being. And from that place, your actions take on a different quality. They are not driven by lack. They are not shaped by hidden expectations. They come from a sense of completeness, a sense that you are already enough, regardless of how others respond. And that understanding brings a kind of freedom that cannot be created through effort. A freedom that comes from letting go, from releasing the need to turn your kindness into a transaction, from allowing your generosity to exist without conditions. And as this becomes clearer, another layer begins to reveal itself, because even when the bargain begins to fade, there is still something that holds onto the habit of giving, something that lives not in the mind alone, but in the body itself. A memory of every time you pushed beyond your limits, every time you said yes when you meant no. And that memory begins to show itself in a way that cannot be ignored, through the body, through the way it holds tension, fatigue, and quiet signals that something needs to change. And as that quiet release begins, as the need to bargain slowly fades, something else becomes impossible to ignore. It is not a thought, it is not a belief, it is something more direct. It is your body. Because while the mind learns slowly, the body has been keeping track the entire time. Every moment you pushed past your limits, every time you ignored that inner hesitation, every time you gave when something inside you had already said enough. None of it disappeared. It stayed. There is a kind of truth that does not speak in words. It shows up in sensations, in fatigue that feels deeper than tiredness, in tension that does not fully release, in a heaviness that follows you even when you are doing nothing. It is the body speaking, and it has been speaking for a long time. The body does not argue, it does not explain, it simply holds. It holds what the mind refuses to acknowledge. It holds the strain of constant giving, the pressure of always being available, the quiet conflict between what you feel and what you continue to do. Each time your heart reached its limit but your voice still said yes, something was stored, not just as memory, but as sensation, a tightening in the chest, a heaviness in the shoulders, a subtle fatigue that lingers no matter how much you rest. At first, these signals are easy to ignore. You tell yourself, you are just tired. You assume it will pass. You push through it the same way you push through everything else. But the body does not forget. It continues to record. each experience layering onto the next, until the accumulation becomes noticeable. You wake up already feeling drained. You move through the day with less energy than before. Simple tasks feel heavier. Conversations feel more demanding. And even when nothing is happening, your body does not feel at ease. This is not random. It is the result of unspoken, emotional labor. The work you have been doing without naming it. The effort of holding space, managing emotions, anticipating needs, maintaining harmony. All of it requires energy. But when it is not acknowledged, when it is not balanced with rest, the body begins to carry the cost. There is also a deeper layer to this. The body responds not only to what you do, but to what you suppress. Every time you feel something and choose not to express it, that energy does not vanish. It moves inward. It settles into the body. It becomes tension. It becomes discomfort. It becomes a quiet signal that something is unresolved. Over time, these signals begin to form patterns. Your body learns to stay slightly tense, slightly alert, slightly prepared, because it has been conditioned to expect the next demand, the next need, the next moment where you must give again. This constant state of readiness affects more than just your energy. It affects your nervous system, your ability to relax, your capacity to feel safe in stillness. Even when you are alone, your body may not fully let go, because it has not been given the chance to reset. This is why rest sometimes feels incomplete. You may lie down, you may sleep, you may take time away from others, but something inside remains active, a subtle alertness, a readiness that does not switch off, because the body is still holding on to what has not been released. Buddhist presence offers a different way of relating to this. It invites you to return to the body, not as something to ignore, but as something to listen to notice sensations without trying to change them, to feel what is there without immediately reacting. This kind of awareness creates space where the body can begin to unwind, not through force, but through attention. When you bring awareness to your body, you begin to see patterns that were previously hidden. You notice where tension gathers, where discomfort lingers, where fatigue feels deeper than it should. And instead of pushing past these sensations, you stay with them. You allow them. You give them attention without judgment. This is not about fixing the body. It is about reconnecting with it. Because for a long time, you have been living more in your responses than in your sensations, more in what others need than in what your body is telling you. And that disconnection has created imbalance. Reconnection begins with small moments. Pausing during the day to notice how you feel physically, feeling your breath, noticing the weight of your body, observing areas of tension without immediately trying to release them. These moments may seem simple, but they are powerful, because they shift your attention inward. They bring you back to a place that has been neglected. Over time, this awareness deepens. You begin to recognize the early signs of exhaustion, the subtle cues that appear before fatigue becomes overwhelming. And when you notice them, you have a choice: to continue as you always have, or to respond differently, to rest, to step back, to say no when needed. This is where the body becomes a guide, not something to push through, but something to listen to. Because it reflects your true state more accurately than your thoughts. Your mind may tell you that you should keep going, that you can handle more, that it is not a big deal. But your body tells a different story. It shows you when you have reached your limit, and ignoring that limit comes with a cost that accumulates over time. But when you begin to honor that limit, something shifts. Your energy stabilizes, your tension decreases, your sense of presence returns, because you are no longer working against yourself. You are working with your own natural rhythm. There is also a quiet relief in recognizing that your exhaustion is valid, that it is not a sign of weakness, that it is not something to be dismissed or minimized. It is the body's response to prolonged imbalance. And acknowledging that response is the first step toward change. This acknowledgement does not require you to fix everything at once. It simply asks you to notice, to be aware of what you have been carrying, to see the connection between your actions and your physical state, and from that awareness, small changes begin to emerge. You take breaks without guilt. You allow yourself to rest without justification. You begin to respect your own energy in a way that feels new, and this respect creates a different relationship with your body, one that is based on listening instead of overriding, on responding instead of pushing, on presence instead of avoidance. Over time, this relationship strengthens. Your body begins to trust that it will be heard, that its signals will not be ignored. And that trust allows it to relax, to release tension more easily, to return to a state of balance. This is not an instant process. It unfolds gradually as you continue to bring awareness to your experience, as you continue to honor your limits, as you continue to choose presence over habit. And in that process, something deeper begins to heal. Not just the exhaustion, but the pattern that created it. The habit of saying yes beyond your capacity, the tendency to ignore your own needs, the disconnect between your actions and your inner state. As these patterns shift, your energy changes. You feel more grounded, more stable, less reactive, because your body is no longer carrying the weight of unspoken emotional labor. It is supported, aligned, at ease, and from that place, your ability to care becomes stronger. Not because you are doing more, but because you are no longer depleted. You are giving from a place of balance, from a place where your body and mind are in agreement, and that agreement creates a kind of peace that cannot be forced, a peace that arises naturally when you stop working against yourself. When you begin to live in a way that respects both your inner and outer world, and as this connection deepens, another layer begins to reveal itself. Because even when the body begins to release what it has been holding, there is still something that shapes how you use your energy, something that quietly pulls you into responsibility for things that were never yours to carry in the first place. And once you begin to see that clearly, your understanding of exhaustion expands in a way that feels both surprising and freeing. And as your body begins to soften, as you finally start listening instead of pushing through, another truth quietly rises into awareness. It does not come from tension this time. It comes from a question that feels almost too honest to ask. Why do you feel responsible for how everyone around you feels? There is a quiet heaviness in that question, not because the answer is complicated, but because it has been guiding your life for so long without being named. There is a kind of exhaustion that does not come from what you do, but from what you believe you must manage. It is not about physical effort. It is about emotional responsibility that slowly expands until it includes everyone around you. And somewhere along the way, without fully realizing it, you begin to carry something that was never yours. The responsibility for other people's peace. There is a subtle shift that happens in relationships when you start paying close attention to how others feel. At first, it is awareness. You notice changes in tone, energy, expressions. You become sensitive to tension, to discomfort, to emotional imbalance. This sensitivity feels like connection. It allows you to respond, to adjust, to support. But slowly, that awareness turns into responsibility. You begin to feel that it is your role to keep things stable, to make sure no one feels too upset, to smooth out disagreements before they grow, to offer reassurance before someone even asks for it. And without noticing it, you begin to take on a role that is far heavier than it appears. You become the stabilizer, the one who absorbs tension, the one who brings calm, the one who ensures that everything remains emotionally balanced. At first, this role feels meaningful. It gives you purpose. It gives you a sense of control. It makes you feel like you are contributing to harmony. But over time, the cost becomes clear, because harmony that depends on your constant effort is not stable. It requires you to be always alert, always aware, always ready to step in, and that constant readiness drains something inside you. You begin to notice that your own joy becomes secondary. You're so focused on maintaining peace around you that you forget to experience peace within you. Your attention moves outward, toward others, toward their needs, towards their emotions. And slowly, your connection to your own experience begins to fade. This is where joy begins to disappear, not suddenly, but gradually, because joy requires presence. It requires space. It requires a mind that is not constantly managing external states. But when your focus is always on keeping others steady, there is little room left for your own experience. You may still smile, you may still engage, but something feels different. Lighter moments do not feel as full. Calm moments do not feel as deep, because part of your awareness is always elsewhere, checking, monitoring, ensuring. This constant monitoring creates a quiet tension, a feeling that you cannot fully relax, because something might shift, someone might need you, something might require your attention. And that anticipation keeps your mind from settling. This is not just a habit, it is a pattern rooted in belief. A belief that peace must be maintained, that discomfort must be avoided, that emotional instability is something to fix, and that you are the one who must fix it. But this belief carries a hidden burden because it places you in a position that is not sustainable. You are trying to manage something that is inherently uncontrollable. Other people's emotions, their reactions, their experiences. These things are shaped by their own thoughts, their own history, their own path. They are not something you can fully influence, no matter how much you try. And yet, when you take responsibility for them, you begin to feel the weight of something that cannot be carried. This is where exhaustion deepens, because you are not only managing your own life, you are attempting to stabilize multiple emotional realities at once. And that effort is endless. There is always another moment, another situation, another shift in someone's mood, and each time you respond, you adjust, you try to bring things back to balance, but that balance is temporary, because it does not come from within them, it comes from your effort. And that effort cannot be maintained forever. Buddhist teachings offer a different perspective. They remind us that each being walks their own path, their own karma, their own process of growth and understanding. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop interfering with what is not yours to control. It means you allow others to experience their emotions without immediately trying to change them. Because emotions are not problems. They are part of the human experience. They rise, they fall, they move. And when you try to control them for others, you interrupt that natural flow. You prevent them from fully experiencing and understanding what they are going through. At the same time, you place yourself in a position of constant effort, trying to hold something that is not meant to be held. Letting go of this responsibility does not mean becoming indifferent. It means recognizing the limits of your role. You can support, you can listen, you can be present, but you do not need to stabilize everything. You do not need to prevent discomfort. You do not need to ensure that everyone feels okay all the time. This realization can feel uncomfortable at first, because it challenges the role you have been playing, the identity of being the one who keeps things together. But it also brings relief, because it removes a weight you were never meant to carry. When you step back from this responsibility, something begins to shift. Your attention returns to your own experience. Your awareness becomes more balanced, not entirely outward, not entirely inward, but grounded, present. You begin to notice what brings you joy, what feels light, what feels natural, things that were once overshadowed by constant responsibility. This return to yourself is not selfish, it is necessary, because without it, your energy continues to drain, your presence becomes strained, your ability to care becomes limited. But when you reconnect with your own experience, your energy begins to restore, your mind becomes clearer, your body becomes lighter, because you are no longer carrying the emotional weight of everyone around you. You are allowing them to carry their own. And this does not weaken your relationships, it strengthens them. Because they become more authentic, less dependent, less controlled. People are allowed to feel what they feel, without immediate intervention, without constant adjustment. And in that space, something important happens. They begin to navigate their own experiences. They begin to find their own balance. And you are no longer the one holding everything together. You are simply part of the connection, not responsible for it. This shift also brings a different kind of peace. A peace that is not dependent on everything being calm around you, but on your ability to remain steady within yourself, even when others are not. Because true peace is not about controlling external conditions. It is about your relationship with them. And when you release the need to manage everything, your relationship changes. You become less reactive, less tense, less burdened. Because you are no longer trying to shape what is beyond your control. You are allowing life to unfold and responding from a place of clarity instead of urgency. This clarity creates space, space where your energy is not constantly being pulled outward, space where your joy can return, not as something forced, but as something natural, because it is no longer being overshadowed by responsibility. Over time, this becomes your new way of relating. You care deeply, but you do not carry everything. You support, but you do not stabilize every situation. You are present, but you are not responsible for how everything feels. And this balance changes how you experience life. It becomes lighter, more fluid, less demanding, because you are no longer trying to control what cannot be controlled. You are simply participating. And in that participation, there is freedom, a quiet freedom that allows you to breathe more fully, to rest more deeply, to experience moments without constantly adjusting them. And as this understanding settles, another layer begins to reveal itself, because even when you release the responsibility for others' peace, there is still something that can make it difficult to fully rest. A subtle discomfort with stillness itself. A feeling that being empty, being quiet, being inward is something to avoid. And once you begin to see that clearly, you start to understand why rest has always felt just out of reach. And as that weight begins to fall away, as you slowly release the need to hold everyone else together, something unexpected appears in its place. It is not noise, it is not pressure, it is something quieter than that. It is space. At first, it does not feel comforting. It feels unfamiliar, almost unsettling. Because for a long time, your life has been filled with movement, with response, with giving, with doing. There has always been something to focus on, something to manage, something to offer. And now, without all that constant outward motion, you are left with something you have not spent much time with, your own stillness. There is a feeling that rises in that stillness. It is not exactly discomfort, but it is not ease either. It feels like standing in a quiet room after being surrounded by noise for years. The silence feels loud, the absence of demand feels strange, and the first instinct is to fill it, to reach for something, a message, a task, a conversation, a distraction, because emptiness in this sense does not feel like peace. It feels like something is missing. This is where a deeper pattern begins to reveal itself. For a long time, your sense of meaning has been tied to activity, to giving, to responding, to being engaged with others. That constant output has shaped how you experience yourself. It has become your rhythm, your normal. So when that rhythm slows, when the external demands decrease, the absence feels unfamiliar, not because something is wrong, but because you are not used to it. There is a quiet fear that lives in that unfamiliar space, a fear that if you stop doing, you might lose something. Your sense of purpose, your sense of connection, your sense of identity. So you keep moving. You keep filling your time. You keep finding ways to stay engaged, even when you are tired, even when you do not need to, because stillness feels uncertain. This is the spiritual cost of never letting yourself be empty. It is not just about physical exhaustion, it is about losing the ability to be with yourself without needing something to happen, without needing to produce, to respond, to give. And that loss creates a subtle imbalance, because the mind needs both movement and stillness, both expression and quiet. Without stillness, there is no space to reset, no space to process, no space to simply exist without expectation. Buddhist teaching places deep importance on this kind of emptiness, not as something to avoid, but as something sacred, a space where the mind is not occupied, where it is not reaching outward, where it is not trying to control or manage anything. This emptiness is not a void, it is a foundation, a place where clarity can arise, but when you are not used to it, it can feel uncomfortable, because it removes all the familiar distractions. It leaves you alone with your own experience, and that experience may include things you have not fully faced, feelings that were set aside, thoughts that were pushed down, sensations that were ignored. When you are constantly active, these things remain in the background. But in stillness, they become visible. And that visibility can feel intense, so the instinct is to move away from it, to return to activity, to fill the space again. But each time you do this, you miss an opportunity to reconnect with yourself, to understand what has been sitting beneath the surface, to allow your mind and body to settle in a way that is not possible through constant doing. There is also a deeper belief that contributes to this pattern. The idea that rest must be earned. That stillness is something you allow only when everything else is taken care of. But when your life is built around constant output, there is always something else. Another task, another need, another reason to stay engaged. And so stillness is postponed again and again until it becomes unfamiliar, until it feels like something you do not know how to enter. This is where exhaustion becomes more than physical, because even when you try to rest, your mind does not fully settle. It continues to move, to think, to anticipate, to plan, because it has been conditioned to stay active, to stay engaged, to stay in motion. Learning to be empty again is not about forcing stillness. It is about allowing it, gently, without pressure, without expectation. It begins with small moments, moments where you do not reach for distraction, where you allow yourself to sit quietly, even if it feels uncomfortable at first, even if your mind resists. This resistance is natural, it is the result of habit. But with time, something begins to shift. The discomfort softens, the urge to fill the space becomes less intense, and the quiet begins to feel different, less like absence, more like presence. You begin to notice things you did not notice before, the rhythm of your breath, the subtle sensations in your body, the way your thoughts move and settle. This awareness brings a different kind of clarity, because it is not filtered through activity, it is direct, uninterrupted. And in that clarity, something important happens. You begin to reconnect with yourself, not the version of you that is always giving or responding, but the version that simply exists, without needing to prove anything, without needing to maintain any role. This reconnection is subtle but powerful, because it restores something that has been missing, a sense of being grounded in your own experience, instead of constantly reaching outward. Over time, this stillness becomes more familiar, less uncomfortable, more natural. You begin to see it not as something to avoid, but as something to return to, a place where your energy can restore, where your mind can settle, where your body can relax without being pulled in different directions. There is also a quiet joy that begins to emerge, Not the kind that comes from excitement or activity, but a deeper kind. A calm, steady sense of ease, a feeling that you are enough, even when you are doing nothing. This is the sacredness of inward quiet. It is not about withdrawal from life. It is about balance, about creating space within yourself where you are not constantly engaged, where you are not defined by what you do, where you can simply be. And from that place, everything changes. Your actions become more intentional, your giving becomes more balanced, your presence becomes more grounded, because it is supported by stillness instead of driven by constant output. This shift also changes how you relate to time. You no longer feel the need to fill every moment, to stay busy, to stay productive. You begin to allow pauses, gaps, moments where nothing is happening, and instead of feeling uncomfortable, these moments begin to feel necessary, restorative. They become part of your rhythm, not something you escape from, but something you return to. And in that rhythm, your energy stabilizes, your exhaustion decreases, because you are no longer moving in one direction. You are allowing the natural flow between activity and rest, between giving and receiving, between outward engagement and inward quiet. This balance is what has been missing, not because you lacked discipline or strength, but because you never allowed yourself to be empty, to experience the fullness of stillness. And once you begin to allow it, something shifts, not dramatically, but steadily. Your relationship with yourself deepens, your sense of presence becomes clearer, your ability to rest becomes real. And from that place you begin to understand something important. That emptiness is not something to fear, it is something to trust, because within it there is space for everything else to settle, to align, to find its natural place. And as this understanding deepens, another layer begins to reveal itself. Because even when you begin to embrace stillness, there is still a moment where something rises, a feeling that questions your choice, a sense of guilt that appears when you finally begin to choose yourself. And once you begin to see that clearly, you start to understand why rest has always felt like something you needed to justify. And just as that stillness begins to feel safe, just as you finally allow yourself to pause without rushing back into motion, something rises the moment you turn inward. It is not noise from the outside, it is something from within. A quiet discomfort that does not match the peace you expected, because the moment you choose yourself, the moment you rest, step back or say no, something appears that feels almost immediate. Guilt. It does not ask permission. It does not wait. It arrives quickly, as if it has been waiting for this exact moment. There is a strange tension in choosing yourself, a subtle pull that makes you question whether you are doing something wrong. Even when your body feels relief, even when your mind begins to soften, there is a part of you that resists that ease. It whispers quietly, you should be doing something else. It reminds you of people you could be helping, responsibilities you could be handling, expectations you might not be meeting. And suddenly, rest feels complicated, not because it is difficult to stop, but because it is difficult to feel at peace when you do. This is where guilt begins to shape your experience. It turns stillness into something you must justify. It turns boundaries into something you must defend. It turns self-care into something that feels almost selfish. But this feeling is not random. It has been built over time, through repeated patterns, through beliefs that were absorbed slowly, without question. At some point, you learned that your value is connected to what you give, that being present for others is more important than being present for yourself, that your needs come after everyone else's. These ideas did not appear all at once. They formed through experience, through moments where giving was rewarded, where being available was appreciated, where stepping back felt like rejection. And over time, those moments shaped how you see yourself. They created a standard, a quiet rule that says, this is how you should be, So when you step outside that rule, even in a small way, something feels off. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are breaking a pattern. And the mind reacts to that break with discomfort. That discomfort is labeled as guilt. But guilt, in this case, is not a reflection of truth. It is a reflection of conditioning. It is the echo of old beliefs trying to maintain their place. Because patterns do not disappear easily. They resist change. They create tension when you act differently. And that tension often shows up as guilt. Understanding this changes everything. Because instead of seeing guilt as a sign that you are wrong, you begin to see it as a signal that something is shifting, that you are stepping outside a familiar way of being, that you are choosing differently. This shift is not easy, because guilt feels real. It feels convincing. It carries a weight that makes you second-guess yourself. You may start to question your decisions, to wonder if you are being too distant, too unavailable, too focused on yourself. You may feel the urge to return to what is familiar, to say yes again, to step back into the role that feels safe. But each time you do, the pattern continues, and the exhaustion returns. This is where Buddhist insight offers a deeper understanding. It teaches that not every feeling reflects reality. Some feelings arise from habit, from past experiences, from patterns that have been repeated so often they feel true. But feeling something does not make it accurate. Guilt in this context is not pointing to harm. It is pointing to change. It is the mind adjusting to a new way of being. And when you see it this way, your relationship with guilt begins to shift. You no longer react to it immediately. You observe it. You notice when it appears. You feel its presence without letting it dictate your actions. This creates space between the feeling and your response. And in that space, something important happens. You regain choice. You are no longer controlled by the discomfort. You can act based on what is actually needed, not on what feels familiar. This does not mean guilt disappears instantly. It may still arise, especially in the beginning, because the patterns that created it have been reinforced for a long time. But over time, its intensity decreases. Its hold weakens, because you are no longer feeding it through automatic responses. There is also a deeper layer to this experience, a sense of responsibility that extends beyond action. A belief that you are responsible for how others feel when you choose yourself. If someone is disappointed, you feel at fault. If someone reacts negatively, you feel like you caused it. And this belief strengthens the guilt, because it connects your actions directly to others' emotions. But this connection is not as direct as it seems. People respond based on their own expectations, their own needs, their own patterns. Their reactions are shaped by their experience, not just your actions. Understanding this allows you to step back from that sense of responsibility, to recognize that you are not in control of how others feel. You can act with care, with awareness, with respect, but you cannot prevent every emotional response. And trying to do so leads to exhaustion. Letting go of this responsibility does not make you careless. It makes you clear. Clear about what you can control and what you cannot. Clear about where your role ends and another person's begins. This clarity reduces the weight of guilt, because you are no longer carrying what is not yours. You begin to see that choosing yourself does not harm others. It simply changes the dynamic. It introduces a new balance, one where your needs are included, one where your energy is considered, one where your presence is not based on sacrifice alone. This balance is necessary because without it, your giving becomes unsustainable, your energy becomes depleted, your presence becomes strained, and eventually you reach a point where you cannot continue in the same way. Choosing yourself before that point is not selfish, it is wise. It is a way of preserving your ability to care without losing yourself. There is also a quiet strength that develops when you move through guilt without reacting to it. Each time you allow it to be there without changing your decision, you reinforce a new pattern. A pattern where your actions are guided by awareness, not by discomfort. And over time, this becomes more natural. You begin to trust your decisions, to feel more grounded in your choices, to act without constantly second-guessing yourself. This trust is important because it allows you to move through life with more ease, less internal conflict, less tension, more clarity. And from that clarity, your relationships also change. They become more honest, more balanced, because you are no longer acting from obligation alone. You are acting from choice. And that choice carries a different energy, one that is not burdened by guilt, but supported by understanding. As this understanding deepens, you begin to notice something. The moments where you once felt guilty start to feel different, lighter, less intense, because the meaning attached to them has changed. You no longer see them as mistakes. You see them as necessary steps toward balance. And in that shift, something important happens. Rest becomes easier. Boundaries become clearer. Your sense of self becomes stronger, because it is no longer shaped by the need to avoid guilt, but by the ability to move through it. And as this ability grows, another layer begins to reveal itself, because even when guilt starts to fade, there is still a belief that can quietly influence how you give. A belief about what love is supposed to look like. A belief that has shaped how much you are willing to sacrifice. And once you begin to see that clearly, you start to understand why giving has always felt like something that must come at a cost. And as that guilt begins to loosen, as you slowly stop questioning every moment you choose yourself, something deeper starts to come into focus. It is not just about how you act or how you feel when you rest. It is about what you have been taught to believe about love itself. Because beneath the guilt, beneath the patterns, beneath the exhaustion, there is a quiet idea that has been shaping everything. A belief that love must be proven, and not just proven, but proven through effort, through sacrifice, through how much you are willing to give, even when it costs you something. There is a feeling many people carry without ever naming it. A sense that if something does not require effort, if it does not stretch you, if it does not leave you a little tired, then maybe it is not real. That ease cannot be trusted. That comfort is not enough. So you push, you give more. You show up even when you are already drained, because somewhere inside there is a belief that this is what love looks like. That love must cost something. That love must take something from you. That love must feel like you are giving beyond what is easy. At first, this belief feels meaningful. It gives depth to your actions. It makes your effort feel valuable. It creates a sense that what you are doing matters. But over time, something begins to shift. The same effort that once felt meaningful begins to feel heavy. The same sacrifices that once felt right begin to feel draining. And yet, the pattern continues, because the belief has not been questioned. There is a subtle pressure that comes from this idea, a pressure to keep proving, to keep showing that you care, to keep demonstrating your love through action, even when those actions no longer feel balanced, even when they begin to take more than they give. This is where the illusion begins to create suffering, because love becomes something that must be earned, maintained, proven again and again, and that constant proving creates exhaustion. Not because love itself is exhausting, but because the way you are expressing it is not sustainable. There is also a quiet comparison that happens within this pattern. You begin to measure your love by how much you are willing to endure, how much you are willing to give up, how much you are willing to sacrifice. And the more you give, the more you feel like you are doing it right. But this measurement is flawed because it is based on quantity, not quality, on effort, not alignment, on how much you can give, not how true your giving feels. Over time, this creates a disconnect, a gap between what you feel and what you do, because you continue to give even when your energy is low, even when your body is asking for rest, even when your mind is overwhelmed. And in that gap, something important is lost: your connection to yourself. You begin to act from expectation instead of awareness, from belief instead of truth. And that creates tension, because your actions no longer reflect your actual state. They reflect what you think you should do. Buddhist wisdom gently challenges this belief. It shows that love does not require suffering to be real, that care does not need to come at the cost of your well-being, that compassion can exist without depletion. True compassion is balanced. It includes both the giver and the receiver. It does not elevate one at the expense of the other. It does not ask you to lose yourself in order to care for someone else. Instead, it flows from a place of wholeness, a place where your energy is steady, where your presence is grounded, where your actions are aligned with your capacity. This kind of love feels different. It does not feel urgent. It does not feel forced. It does not require you to push past your limits. It moves naturally, without strain, without the need to prove anything. But when you are used to the old pattern, this new way can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because it does not match what you have learned. It does not feel intense in the same way. It does not carry the same weight, and that can create doubt. You may wonder if it is enough, if it is real, if it holds the same value. But that doubt is part of the transition. It is the mind adjusting to a different understanding, a different relationship with love, one that is not built on exhaustion. There is also a deeper realization that begins to unfold, that the belief linking love to suffering may not have come from nowhere. It may have been shaped by experiences, moments where love was inconsistent, where care was conditional, where effort was required to receive attention or approval. And those moments left an imprint, a sense that love must be maintained through action, that it must be proven through giving, that it must be earned. But these patterns are not permanent. They can be seen, understood, released. And when you begin to see them clearly, something shifts. You start to question the need to prove, to push, to sacrifice beyond what feels right. You begin to explore a different way of relating, one where love is not something you demonstrate through exhaustion, but something you express through presence, through attention, through care that is balanced and sustainable. This shift changes how you give. You no longer feel the need to overextend, to go beyond your limits to show that you care. Instead, you give within your capacity, within what feels true, and that giving feels different. It feels lighter, more genuine, more aligned with your energy, because it is not driven by pressure, it is guided by awareness. There is also a quiet freedom in letting go of the idea that more effort equals more love, because it removes the constant need to measure, to compare, to evaluate whether you are doing enough. You simply respond to what is needed, without turning it into a test of your commitment. And that response becomes more natural, more fluid, less forced. This does not mean you stop caring deeply. It means your care is no longer tied to how much you can endure. It is tied to how present you are, how aware you are, how aligned your actions are with your inner state. And this alignment creates a different kind of connection, one that is not built on sacrifice alone, but on mutual respect, on understanding, on the recognition that both people matter, including you. Over time, this changes how you experience love. It becomes less about effort and more about presence, less about proving and more about being, less about giving everything and more about giving what is true. And in that shift, exhaustion begins to fade, because you are no longer pushing yourself beyond your limits. You are moving within them. There is also a deeper sense of peace that begins to emerge, a feeling that you do not need to constantly show that you care, that your presence is enough, That your love is not something that must be demonstrated through struggle. This peace is quiet but powerful because it removes the pressure that has been driving your actions. It allows you to rest without questioning your value, to step back without feeling like you are losing something, to exist without needing to prove anything. And as this understanding settles, your relationship with giving changes. It becomes more intentional, more balanced, more sustainable, because it is no longer shaped by the need to prove love through exhaustion. It is guided by a deeper awareness of what love truly is, a presence that does not require suffering, a care that does not demand sacrifice beyond what is healthy, a connection that does not depend on constant effort. And as this becomes clearer, another layer begins to reveal itself. Because even when you begin to release this belief, there is still something that can reshape how you see your exhaustion. A different way of understanding it, not as a problem to fix, but as something that has been trying to show you something all along. And once you begin to see it in that way, your relationship with your own limits begins to change in a way that feels unexpectedly meaningful. And as that pressure begins to dissolve, as you slowly stop measuring your love through how much you can endure, something else begins to come into view. It is not another rule, not another pattern to fix, but a different way of seeing everything you have been feeling. Because what if this exhaustion was never just a problem? What if it was trying to show you something all along? There is a moment, often quiet, where the body and mind stop cooperating in the same way they used to. Things that once felt easy begin to feel heavy. Energy that once seemed endless becomes limited. The willingness to keep showing up in the same way begins to fade. And in that moment, it is easy to believe that something has gone wrong. That you are weaker than before, less capable, less patient, less strong. But this interpretation misses something important. Because what you call burnout is not always collapse. Sometimes it is resistance. A quiet, internal refusal to continue living in a way that no longer feels right. There is a kind of intelligence in exhaustion that is often overlooked. It does not come with clear instructions. It does not explain itself in words, but it communicates through sensation, through limitation, through the simple inability to keep doing what you have always done. This inability is not random. It is a signal, a boundary that has finally become impossible to ignore. For a long time, you were able to push past your limits. You were able to override discomfort, to keep going, even when something inside you was asking for rest. That ability may have felt like strength, but over time, that strength began to work against you, because it allowed imbalance to continue. It allowed patterns that drained you to remain in place. It allowed you to ignore what needed attention, until eventually the system could no longer sustain itself. And when that point is reached, something shifts. The same actions no longer feel possible. The same energy is no longer available. The same patterns no longer hold. This is where exhaustion becomes a teacher, not because it feels pleasant, but because it forces you to stop, to pause, to reconsider what you have been doing. There is a clarity that emerges when you can no longer continue in the same way, a clarity that was not accessible before because you were too busy moving, responding, giving, maintaining. Now, without that constant motion, you are faced with something different, your reality without distraction. And in that space, you begin to see things more clearly. You see the patterns that led you here, the ways you have been overextending, the habits that have kept you in a state of imbalance, the beliefs that have shaped your choices. This seeing is not always comfortable. It may bring up regret, frustration, a sense that you should have noticed sooner. But this perspective is not helpful because it keeps you focused on what has already happened, instead of what is being revealed now. Exhaustion is not asking you to look back with judgment. It is inviting you to look inward with awareness, to understand what has been out of balance, to recognize where change is needed, and to begin responding differently. This is where the transformation begins. Not in forcing yourself to recover quickly, not in trying to return to your previous level of activity, but in listening. Listening to what your exhaustion is showing you, listening to the signals your body has been giving, listening to the resistance that now appears where there was once compliance. This listening requires patience, because the answers are not immediate. They unfold gradually, through observation, through reflection, through the willingness to stay present with what is, instead of trying to escape it. There is also a deeper shift that begins to take place, a change in how you define strength. Before, strength may have meant endurance, the ability to keep going no matter what, to handle everything without breaking, to carry more than what felt comfortable. But now, that definition begins to change. Strength becomes something else, the ability to stop, to recognize when something is not sustainable, to choose rest instead of pushing through, to honor your limits instead of ignoring them. This kind of strength is quieter, less visible, but more aligned with your well-being. It does not seek to prove anything. It seeks to preserve balance. And this balance is what allows true resilience to develop. Not the resilience that comes from constant effort, but the resilience that comes from understanding your capacity, from knowing when to engage and when to step back, from responding to your needs instead of overriding them. There is also a release that comes with this shift. A release from the pressure to be the same as before, to function in the same way, to meet the same expectations, because you begin to see that those expectations may not have been aligned with your true capacity. They may have been based on patterns that were not sustainable, and letting go of them is not failure. It is adjustment. It is growth. It is the natural process of moving toward a more balanced way of living. This process may feel slow, at times uncertain, because you are no longer following familiar patterns. You are creating something new, a new way of relating to your energy, your time, your presence. And that creation takes time. But within it, there is something valuable, a deeper understanding of yourself, a clearer sense of what matters, a more grounded connection to your own experience. This understanding allows you to move forward differently, not by returning to the same habits, but by integrating what you have learned. You begin to set boundaries earlier, to notice when your energy starts to shift, to respond before exhaustion becomes overwhelming. You begin to give in a way that feels sustainable, to rest without waiting for collapse, to maintain balance instead of correcting imbalance after it has already grown. This is the lesson that exhaustion brings, not as punishment, but as guidance, a way of showing you what cannot continue and pointing you toward what needs to change. There is also a quiet compassion that begins to develop for yourself, for what you have been carrying, for the patterns you have been living within. This compassion is not based on judgment. It is based on understanding, on recognizing that you were doing what you thought was right, what felt necessary, what aligned with your beliefs at the time. And now, with new awareness, you can choose differently, without blame, without shame, just with clarity. This clarity changes how you relate to your exhaustion. It is no longer something to fight against, something to fix as quickly as possible. It becomes something to learn from, something to move through with awareness, and in that shift, the experience itself changes. It becomes less overwhelming, less confusing, because it has meaning, because it is guiding you toward something, a more balanced way of living, a more sustainable way of giving, a more aligned way of being. And as you continue to move through this process, something begins to stabilize. Your energy, your mind, your sense of self, because you are no longer pushing against your limits, you are working with them. You are allowing your experience to inform your choices, instead of forcing your choices to override your experience. This alignment creates a different kind of peace, not one that comes from external conditions, but one that arises from internal balance, from knowing that you are living in a way that supports your well-being, that respects your capacity, that allows you to care without losing yourself, and from that place, your relationship with exhaustion changes. It is no longer something to fear, it becomes something you understand, something that signals when adjustment is needed, something that keeps you connected to your own limits. And as this understanding deepens, another layer begins to reveal itself. Because even when you begin to learn from exhaustion, there is still something that can arise alongside it. A feeling that is not about what you need to change now, but about what has already been lost. A quiet sadness that comes from realizing how long you have been living in a way that was not aligned. And once you begin to feel that fully, it opens a different kind of awareness. One that is not about correction, but about reflection. And as that understanding begins to settle, as you stop fighting your exhaustion and start listening to it, something softer begins to rise. It is not resistance, it is not confusion, it is something deeper, a quiet sadness, not loud, not overwhelming, but steady. It does not come from what you need to change next. It comes from what you begin to see about the past. Because when awareness finally opens, it does not only show you where you are, it also reveals where you have been. There is a feeling that arrives when you begin to notice how long you have been living in a certain way, how many moments you moved through without checking in with yourself, how many times you ignored what you felt in order to meet what was expected, and that realization carries weight. It is not the kind of sadness that comes from a single event. It is the kind that comes from seeing a pattern stretch across time, a pattern that shaped your choices, your relationships, your sense of self. The grief of realizing how long you abandoned yourself does not appear all at once. It unfolds slowly as different memories come into focus. Moments that once felt normal begin to look different. Times when you said yes, even though something inside you resisted. Times when you stayed silent instead of expressing what you needed. Times when you pushed yourself beyond your limits without question. At the time, those choices may have felt necessary. They may have seemed like the right thing to do. But now, with a different awareness, you begin to see what was happening beneath the surface. You were choosing others over yourself. Not occasionally, but consistently. And over time, that consistency created distance. Distance between you and your own experience. Between what you felt and what you allowed yourself to express. Between your needs and the way you lived. This distance is not always visible while it is happening. It becomes clear only when you pause long enough to notice it. And when you do, there is a sense of loss, not because something external was taken from you, but because something internal was overlooked. Your attention, your care, your presence with yourself. There is a quiet recognition that you were there for others in ways you were not there for yourself, that you extended understanding outward, but rarely turned it inward, that you listened deeply to others, but often ignored your own voice. This recognition is painful, not because it points to failure, but because it reveals something that mattered. Your own experience, your own needs, your own sense of being. And seeing how often those things were set aside brings a kind of grief that is difficult to name. It is not regret in the usual sense. It is not about wishing things had been different in a simple way. It is about feeling the weight of what was not acknowledged. The moments where you could have paused but did not. The times where you could have chosen differently but followed a familiar pattern instead. This grief can feel confusing at first because it is not directed at anyone. It is not about blaming others. It is about seeing your own participation in a pattern that led you away from yourself. And that kind of seeing requires honesty, a willingness to look without turning away, without softening the truth, but also without harsh judgment, because the goal is not to criticize what you did, it is to understand why you did it. There is a compassion that begins to develop when you look at your past through this lens. You begin to see that your actions were shaped by what you believed at the time, by the patterns you learned, by the ways you were taught to relate to others and to yourself. You were not trying to harm yourself. You were trying to navigate life with the tools you had, and those tools may have led you to prioritize others, to avoid conflict, to maintain connection at the cost of your own needs. Understanding this does not remove the grief, but it softens it. It replaces judgment with awareness. It allows you to hold your past with a kind of gentleness, instead of pushing it away or trying to ignore it. There is also a sense of time that becomes more noticeable in this process. You may begin to think about how long these patterns were in place, how many years you moved in a certain way, how much of your life was shaped by choices that did not fully include you. And that awareness can feel heavy because it brings attention to something that cannot be changed. The past remains as it is. But this is where another understanding begins to emerge. The past is not where your power lies. Your awareness of it is, because seeing clearly what has happened changes how you move forward. It allows you to break patterns that once felt automatic. It gives you the ability to choose differently, to respond with awareness instead of habit. And that is where the significance of this grief begins to shift. It is no longer just about what was lost. It becomes about what is now possible. There is a quiet turning point in this process, a moment where the focus begins to move, from looking back to being present, from feeling the weight of what was to recognizing what is available now. Because even though time has passed, your ability to relate to yourself differently is here, in this moment, in your current awareness. This does not erase the past, but it changes your relationship to it. It allows you to integrate what you have seen, to let it inform your choices without keeping you stuck in regret. There is also a sense of reconnection that begins to take place. As you bring attention back to yourself, you start to notice things you may have overlooked, your preferences, your limits, your feelings, your needs. They begin to come into focus. Not as something new, but as something that has been waiting for your attention, waiting for your presence. And as you begin to engage with these parts of yourself, something shifts. The distance starts to close. The connection begins to rebuild, not in a dramatic way, but in small, consistent moments. Moments where you check in with yourself before responding. Moments where you acknowledge what you feel without dismissing it. Moments where you choose based on what is true for you. These moments may seem simple, but they carry significance because they represent a different way of being, one that includes you, one that does not require you to step aside in order to maintain connection, one that allows you to exist fully within your own life. There is also a quiet sense of forgiveness that begins to emerge, not as a forced act, but as a natural response to understanding. You begin to see that holding on to blame, even toward yourself, does not serve you. It keeps you tied to the past. It prevents you from moving forward with clarity. But when you understand the patterns that shaped your actions, forgiveness becomes possible, not as something you have to do, but as something that arises, because you see that you were doing what you could with what you knew. And now, with greater awareness, you can do something different. This shift does not remove the sadness completely, but it transforms it. It becomes less about loss and more about recognition. Recognition of what matters. Recognition of what needs to change. recognition of the value of your own presence in your life. And from that recognition, something new begins to grow, a sense of responsibility toward yourself. Not in a heavy way, but in a caring way. A desire to include yourself in your own decisions, to consider your needs alongside others, to create a balance that was not present before. This responsibility is not a burden, it is a form of respect. A way of acknowledging that your experience matters, that your well-being is important, that your presence in your own life is not optional. And as this sense of responsibility deepens, your actions begin to reflect it. You set limits more clearly, you express yourself more honestly. You rest without as much resistance, because you understand what happens when you do not. You have seen the result of neglecting your own needs, and that understanding guides you, gently but firmly, toward a different way of living, a way that includes both care for others and care for yourself, a way that does not require you to abandon one in order to maintain the other. And as this new way of being takes shape, the grief begins to settle, not because it disappears, but because it has served its purpose. It has shown you what needed to be seen. It has opened your awareness. It has guided you toward change. And now it becomes part of your understanding, part of the path that led you here. And from this place, another layer begins to reveal itself. Because even when you begin to reconnect with yourself, there may still be something driving your giving. A deeper fear that shapes how you relate to others, a fear that is not always visible, but influences your actions in quiet ways. And once you begin to see that clearly, you start to understand why letting go has always felt more difficult than it should. And as that quiet reconnection begins, as you slowly return to yourself after years of moving outward, another layer reveals itself. It is more hidden, more personal, and often harder to admit. Because sometimes the giving was not only about kindness, it was about staying close, staying seen, staying in someone's life. There is a feeling that sits deep in the background for many people. It does not speak loudly, but it shapes decisions in ways that feel automatic. It is the subtle fear of being left behind, not always abandoned in a dramatic sense, but quietly replaced, forgotten, or no longer needed in the same way. This fear does not appear suddenly. It forms over time, through moments where connection felt uncertain, through experiences where presence was not guaranteed, through situations where closeness depended on something being offered, something being done, something being maintained. And from those moments, a pattern begins to take shape. A belief that connection must be secured, that closeness is not stable on its own, that it must be protected, reinforced, maintained through action. So you give, not just from care, but from a deeper need, a need to remain important, to remain present, to remain someone that cannot be easily forgotten. At first this feels like effort. Then it becomes instinct. You begin to anticipate what others need before they ask. You offer more than what is expected. You make sure you are always available, always supportive, always reliable, because somewhere inside there is a quiet hope. If I do enough, I will not be left behind. If I give enough, I will remain close. If I become essential, I will not be forgotten. This hope does not feel like fear at first. It feels like care. It feels like commitment. But over time, something begins to shift, because the giving is no longer free. It carries a quiet urgency, a need to maintain something that feels fragile. And that urgency creates pressure. You begin to feel responsible for the continuity of the relationship, as if your effort is what keeps it alive. And that responsibility becomes heavy, because relationships are not meant to be held together by one person's giving. They are meant to exist through mutual presence, mutual care, mutual connection. But when fear is involved, balance is lost. You begin to invest more than what is natural, more than what is sustainable, because the goal is not just to connect, it is to secure. And securing something that cannot be controlled creates tension, because no matter how much you give, you cannot fully control how someone else feels. Their attention may shift, their priorities may change, their life may move in a different direction. And when that happens, the fear that has been quietly guiding your actions begins to surface. A sense of instability, a feeling that something is slipping. And the instinct is to give more, to try harder, to hold on. But this effort often leads to more exhaustion, because you are trying to stabilize something that is not meant to be controlled in that way. This is where overgiving becomes a response to fear, not always conscious, but deeply felt, a way of managing uncertainty, a way of reducing the risk of being left behind. But this strategy has a cost, because it requires you to stay in a constant state of effort, to keep proving your place, to keep reinforcing your value, and that constant proving drains your energy. It also creates a subtle imbalance in relationships, because when you give from fear, the dynamic changes. You may begin to tolerate more than what feels right, to accept behaviors that do not align with your needs, to stay present even when something feels off, all in an attempt to maintain closeness. But closeness built on fear is not stable. It requires constant maintenance, constant reassurance, constant effort, and that effort eventually leads to exhaustion. Buddhist understanding brings a different perspective to this pattern. It points to the nature of attachment, the tendency to hold on to people, to roles, to connections, as if they define your sense of security. But attachment, by its nature, creates suffering, because it is based on the idea that something must remain the same, that something must not change. And life does not operate in that way. Everything moves, everything shifts, everything evolves, and trying to hold something still creates tension. The fear of being left behind is deeply connected to this attachment. It is the fear of losing connection, of losing significance, of losing a sense of belonging. But belonging is not something that can be secured through effort alone. It is something that exists when there is alignment, when there is mutual presence, when there is space for both people to be as they are. Overgiving in response to fear often removes that space. It creates a dynamic where one person is constantly adjusting, constantly offering, constantly trying to maintain the connection. And that dynamic can feel heavy, not just for you, but for the relationship itself, because it is not balanced, it is not grounded, it is driven by something beneath the surface. Letting go of this pattern does not mean you stop caring. It means you begin to see where your giving is coming from, to notice when it is driven by fear instead of choice, to recognize the moments when you are trying to secure something instead of simply being present. This awareness creates a different kind of freedom, because it allows you to step back from the urgency, to pause before responding, to ask yourself what is actually needed. Not from the perspective of fear, but from the perspective of clarity. There is also a deeper understanding that begins to emerge, that your value is not dependent on how much you give, that your place in someone's life is not something you have to constantly prove. That connection, when it is real, does not require you to exhaust yourself to maintain it. This understanding can feel unfamiliar, because it challenges a pattern that has been in place for a long time. But it also brings relief, because it removes the constant pressure to perform, to give, to secure. It allows you to be present without needing to manage the outcome, to engage without needing to control the direction, to care without needing to ensure that you will not be left behind. And in that space, something shifts. Your relationships begin to feel different, less forced, less dependent on effort, more natural, because they are no longer driven by fear. They are grounded in presence, in mutual connection, in the understanding that both people are choosing to be there, not because they have to, but because they want to. There is also a quiet strength that develops when you no longer act from fear. A sense that you can stand on your own, that your sense of self is not tied to how others respond, that your presence is enough, even without constant reinforcement. This strength does not remove the possibility of loss, but it changes how you relate to it. You no longer try to prevent it at all costs. You allow space for things to unfold, without holding on too tightly, without trying to control what cannot be controlled. And in that allowance, your energy begins to return, because you are no longer in a constant state of effort, trying to secure something that is not meant to be secured in that way. You are simply present, engaging, connecting, without losing yourself in the process. This shift is not immediate. It unfolds gradually, through awareness, through practice, through the willingness to notice when fear is guiding your actions, and to gently choose differently. Each time you do, the pattern weakens, the urgency softens, the need to overgive decreases. And what remains is something more stable, a connection that is not based on fear, but on presence. A way of relating that does not require you to exhaust yourself. A sense of belonging that is not dependent on constant effort. And as this understanding deepens, another layer begins to reveal itself. Because even when fear begins to loosen, there is still something that can keep you moving in the same pattern. An instinct to step in, to help, to fix, even when it is not necessary. And once you begin to see that clearly, you start to understand how stepping back can sometimes be the most powerful form of care. And as that fear begins to loosen, as you slowly stop giving just to hold people close, another pattern quietly comes into view. It is not driven by fear alone. It is driven by instinct. The instinct to step in, to fix, to help immediately. Because even when you begin to understand your patterns, there is still a pull that appears when someone struggles. A pull that feels urgent, a pull that feels right, but one that often costs you more than you realize. There is a moment that happens quickly, almost without thought. Someone expresses pain, confusion, or difficulty, and something inside you moves forward before you even pause. You begin to think of solutions, to offer advice, to take on a role that feels familiar. It feels like care. It feels like support. But beneath that, there is something else happening. An inability to stay still in the presence of someone else's struggle. There is a discomfort that arises when you witness difficulty. Not just their discomfort, but your own reaction to it. A tension that forms when things are not okay, when someone is uncertain, when a situation remains unresolved. And instead of allowing that tension to exist, the instinct is to remove it, to fix the problem, to ease the situation, to bring things back to stability. This is where the pattern begins, because helping becomes immediate, automatic, unquestioned. You do not ask whether it is needed. You do not consider whether the other person is capable of navigating their experience. You simply respond, and over time, this response becomes your way of relating. But something important is lost in this process. The space for others to face their own path. The space for growth that comes from difficulty. The space where understanding develops through experience. When you step in too quickly, you interrupt that process. Not because you intend to, but because your presence changes the dynamic. The struggle becomes shared, the responsibility shifts, the lesson becomes diluted. And while the immediate discomfort may decrease, something deeper is left unresolved. This is where Buddhist teaching offers a different perspective. It invites you to see struggle not as something to eliminate, but as something to understand. Because struggle is not always a problem. It is often a process. A necessary part of learning, of growth, of becoming aware. Each person carries their own path, their own experiences, their own patterns, their own lessons. And those lessons cannot be learned through someone else's intervention alone. They must be experienced, felt, moved through. This does not mean you withdraw completely. It does not mean you stop caring. It means you change how you respond. Instead of rushing in, you pause, you observe, you allow the moment to exist without immediately trying to change it. This pause is powerful because it creates space where you can see clearly what is actually needed. Not what feels urgent, but what is true. Sometimes what is needed is your presence, not your solution, your ability to listen without directing, to be there without taking control. This kind of presence feels different. It is quieter, less active, but often more supportive, because it allows the other person to remain connected to their own experience, to find their own understanding, to move through their process without being redirected. There is also a shift that happens within you when you practice this. You begin to notice the urge to step in, the impulse to fix, the discomfort that arises when things are unresolved. And instead of acting on it immediately, you stay with it. You allow yourself to feel that discomfort, to sit with the tension, without needing to resolve it right away. This is not easy, because it goes against a deeply ingrained habit. A habit that has been reinforced by years of responding quickly, of being the one who helps. But as you stay with that discomfort, something begins to change. It loses its intensity. It becomes something you can hold without reacting to. And in that space, your awareness deepens. You begin to see that your urge to help is not always about the other person. It is also about your own need to restore balance, to remove discomfort, to feel useful. And recognizing this allows you to respond more consciously. You begin to choose when to step in and when to step back. Not based on habit, but based on clarity. There is also a deeper trust that begins to develop, a trust that others are capable, that they can navigate their own experiences, that they do not need you to carry them through every difficulty. This trust is important because it changes how you relate to others. You no longer see them as fragile, as needing constant support. You see them as individuals with their own strength, their own ability to learn and grow. And this shift creates a different kind of connection, one that is not based on dependency, but on respect. Respect for their path, respect for their process, respect for their ability to move through what they are facing. This does not mean you are absent. It means you are present in a different way. You offer support when it is truly needed. You listen when it is asked. You share when it is appropriate, but you do not take over. You do not assume responsibility for something that belongs to them. This balance is what prevents exhaustion, because you are no longer carrying what is not yours. You are no longer stepping into every situation as if it requires your involvement. You are allowing life to unfold and responding when it aligns with your capacity. There is also a quiet freedom in letting go of the need to fix everything. A release from the constant pressure to be the solution, because you begin to understand that not everything needs to be fixed. Some things need to be experienced. Some things need time. Some things need space. And by allowing that, you create room for natural resolution, for understanding to develop without force, for growth to happen without interference. This understanding also changes how you view love. Love is no longer about removing all discomfort. It is about being present through it, without trying to control the outcome, without needing to change the process, because true care does not always look like action. Sometimes it looks like patience, like stillness, like allowing someone to walk through their experience while knowing you are there. This kind of care feels different. It does not rush. It does not push. It does not take over. It supports without overwhelming. And in that support, something deeper is offered. A sense of space, a sense of respect, a sense of trust. These are things that cannot be given through constant intervention. They emerge when you allow things to unfold. Over time, this way of relating becomes more natural. You feel less urgency to step in, less pressure to respond immediately, more ease in allowing things to be as they are, And this ease creates a different kind of presence, one that is not driven by tension, but by awareness, a presence that allows both you and others to remain grounded, to move through experiences without losing yourselves. And as this understanding settles, another layer begins to reveal itself, because even when you learn to step back, even when you allow others to face their own path, there is still something happening within you, something that continues quietly, not in your actions, but in your thoughts. A constant anticipation, a mental preparation, a subtle scanning of what might be needed next. And once you begin to notice that, you start to see that exhaustion is not only about what you do, it is also about what you carry in your mind. You started this journey feeling drained, confused, wondering why giving so much could leave you feeling so empty. And now, something is clearer. It was never just about how much you gave, it was about why you gave. You were always available, always saying yes, always carrying what was never yours. You confused compassion with sacrifice, love with exhaustion, presence with losing yourself. You tried to earn peace by stabilizing others, to secure connection by overgiving, to prove your worth by how much you could endure. But slowly, something shifted. You saw that constant giving without awareness becomes self-abandonment. You saw that boundaries are not rejection, but clarity. You saw that your body has been speaking long before your mind understood. You saw that guilt is not truth, but conditioning. You saw that love does not need to hurt to be real. And maybe the most important realization of all, you are allowed to exist in your own life, without proving, without exhausting yourself, without carrying everyone else. Because real peace was never going to come from giving more. It comes from returning to yourself. So now, I want to ask you something simple but honest. What is one way you've been overgiving that you are finally ready to let go of? Drop it in the comments, just one sentence. No perfection, no overthinking. Your awareness might be the exact thing someone else needs to hear today. And if this message reached you at the right moment, if something inside you felt seen, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Because this is not just content. This is a space where you come back to yourself, stay with it, stay aware, and most importantly, stay whole.